My wife grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. She leaned close to my ear at our son's own housewarming party in a house full of laughing guests and clinking glasses, and she said, "We need to leave now." I asked her why, right there in the middle of the crowd, and she said nothing. She just held my hand and pulled me toward the door. It wasn't until we were locked inside our car, engine off, driveway full of cars we didn't recognize, that she finally turned to me and asked one question that I still hear in my sleep. "You didn't actually see it, did you?" What she told me next changed the way I looked at my own son for the rest of my life. My name is Frank Sullivan. I'm 58 years old. I've spent 32 years building a plumbing and heating company from nothing but a used van and a phone number on a business card. I live outside Columbus, Ohio, married to my wife Diane for 33 years, and until that Saturday in June, I thought I had exactly one job left in life: watch my son succeed and enjoy the ride. The morning of the party, I put on the blue polo shirt Diane picked out for me and stood in front of the mirror longer than a man my age should. Our son Tyler had just closed on his first house, a real house, not an apartment, not a rental, and he wanted to throw a party to show it off to the family. I remember feeling proud in a way that surprised me, the kind of proud that sits heavy and warm in your chest. Diane came downstairs in a green dress, checked her earrings twice in the hallway mirror, and told me to grab the gift bag off the counter, a set of engraved tools I picked out myself, because that's what a father gives his son when he starts his own life. The drive out to Maple Ridge, the new development on the north side of town, took about 25 minutes. Diane was quiet in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, and I didn't think anything of it. She's always quiet before parties, gathering herself, the way some people need a minute before they walk into a crowded room. I turned up the radio, some old country song, and told her how good it felt to see Tyler land on his feet. I told her I never thought I'd see the day. She just nodded and looked out the window at the new houses going up on both sides of the roadway. Big houses, the kind with 3-car garages and stone fronts. We turned on to Windsor Court a little after 2 in the afternoon. I saw the address on my phone, and then I saw the house itself. And for just a second, before the pride kicked back in, something in my stomach went tight. I didn't know why yet. I just remember thinking the house looked a lot bigger than I expected. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand what came before it. Tyler grew up in my shop, not as a hobby, as a real part of his childhood. He was 12 years old, sweeping floors after school, 16 riding along on service calls, 22 working full-time doing the books while he finished his business degree at night. I never pushed him into plumbing. I always told him he could do anything he wanted. But he loved the business side of things, the numbers, the deals, the way you could turn a small company into something bigger if you were smart about it. 2 years ago, Tyler came to me with an idea. He wanted to start flipping houses on the side, buying older homes, fixing them up, selling them for a profit, and eventually building his own small development company. He said he had a partner lined up who knew the market, someone with connections. I didn't ask too many questions. I trusted him. I gave him $150,000 from money I'd set aside for retirement. Money Diane and I had talked about for years, calling it Tyler's Head Start. I told him to use it wisely, to buy something modest to live in, and put the rest into his first project. He hugged me in the driveway that day and told me he wouldn't let me down. I never asked to see paperwork. I never asked for numbers. I wired the money through our joint business account and let him run with it, because that's what you do when you've raised a good son and you believe in him completely. Looking back now, that trust is exactly what made everything that came later so easy for the people who used it against me. The house on Windsor Court was not modest. It sat on a corner lot with a circular driveway already lined with cars, a stone front, tall windows, and a lawn so green it looked painted on. A young man in a black vest was parking cars for guests, which was something I had never seen at a family party in my life. Diane looked at me as we pulled up behind a line of SUVs and said, "This is a lot of House Frank." I laughed it off and said Tyler always did have big dreams. Inside, the place looked like something out of a magazine. Marble countertops, a chandelier hanging over the entryway, a backyard with a pool already finished, even though the house had only closed a few weeks earlier. There was a catering table with a woman in a white jacket serving little appetizers on trays, and a bartender mixing drinks near the sliding glass doors. I stood in the middle of it all, holding my gift bag of engraved tools, feeling suddenly small in a way I couldn't explain. Tyler came over and hugged me, told me how glad he was we came, and introduced us again to Vanessa's parents, Gordon and Patricia Whitfield. Gordon was a corporate lawyer downtown, the kind of man with a firm handshake and a watch that cost more than my truck. He looked at my polo shirt and my gift bag and said, "Frank, good to see you again," in a tone that managed to be polite and dismissive at the exact same time. Patricia asked if I was still doing the plumbing thing myself or if I had people for that now. I said I still liked getting my hands dirty. She smiled, the way people smile at something they find a little embarrassing. The party rolled on through the afternoon, and I noticed small things I couldn't quite name at the time. Tyler kept drifting toward Gordon and a group of men in expensive shoes standing near the pool, talking in low voices about numbers and shares and something called a funding round. Every time I walked over to join them, the conversation shifted. Someone laughed too quickly, and Tyler would clap me on the shoulder and ask if I wanted another drink. Diane noticed it too. She's always been sharper than me about people, about the little shifts in a room that I miss completely. She leaned over at one point while we were standing near the dessert table and said quietly, "Does Tyler seem different to you?" I told her he was probably just nervous, hosting his first big party, trying to ask Princess family. She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Vanessa herself was polished and warm on the surface, hugging every guest, showing off the kitchen island, laughing loudly at her father's jokes. But every time she looked at Tyler, there was something underneath the smile, something quick and calculating that reminded me of a person checking their watch during a meeting they wanted to end. I told myself I was imagining things. Fathers get protective, I thought. I told myself this was just what success looked like now. Different from the way I'd built things, but not wrong. Around 4 in the afternoon, Diana excused herself to find a bathroom. The downstairs one had a line of guests waiting outside it, so she headed for the staircase, saying she'd find one upstairs instead. I watched her go, still holding my drink, still telling myself everything in that beautiful house was exactly what it looked like. I had no idea that the next 20 minutes would end the version of my life I thought I was living. Diane told me later that the upstairs hallway was quiet compared to the party noise below, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've stepped into a different house entirely. She passed 2 closed doors before finding what she guessed was the primary bedroom, a large room with a bed already made up with new sheets, still holding their fold lines, and a bathroom attached to it with the kind of soaking tub you see in furniture showrooms. She used the bathroom, washed her hands, and on her way back through the bedroom, her eyes landed on the dresser near the window. There was a stack of papers sitting there, the kind of stacked people leave out when they're in the middle of dealing with something, not yet filed away. She said she almost didn't look. She said some small voice in her told her to just walk past it and go back downstairs to the party. But something about the way the papers were left out, still warm from being handled recently, made her stop. The top page was a closing statement from the mortgage company. Diane isn't a numbers person by trade, but 33 years of managing our household finances taught her how to read a bottom line. The purchase price on that page was $1,200,000. She stood there rereading it twice, because that number didn't match anything Tyler had ever told us. He'd said the house was affordable, a smart buy, well within what his flipping business could support. She said her first thought wasn't even suspicion, it was confusion. Where had the rest of that money come from? She almost put the papers down right there and walked away. She told me later she wishes sometimes that she had. But underneath that closing statement was a second folder, and on the tab of that folder, written in blue pen, was the name of my company, Sullivan Plumbing and Heating. Diane opened that folder, standing alone in our son's bedroom, and what she found inside made her sit down slowly on the edge of the bed. There were printed emails between Tyler and a business attorney at Gordon Whitfield's law firm. There was a document titled Ownership Restructuring Agreement with my name typed at the top, and clipped to the front of it was a photocopy of a power of attorney form dated 8 months earlier with my signature at the bottom. She said she recognized my handwriting immediately, the same slanted F I've signed with my whole life, but she also knew, the same way I would know later, that I had never signed anything called a power of attorney in my life. Not that I remembered. Diane sat there with that folder in her lap, her heart pounding, trying to make sense of paperwork that suggested my son and his new father-in-law's law firm were in the middle of legally taking ownership of the company I built with my own 2 hands. She told me the room felt very quiet in that moment, even with music and laughter drifting up faintly from downstairs. She read through the document twice, her hands shaking slightly, trying to understand words like fiduciary transfer and majority interest, words that don't belong in a family, words that belong in a courtroom. She was about to close the folder and put it back exactly where she found it when she heard voices coming from the walk-in closet just off the bedroom. A door she hadn't noticed was slightly open. She recognized Tyler's voice first, low intense, and then Vanessa's sharper, more certain. Diane froze where she sat, the folder still opened in her lap, and she did something she had never done in her life. She sat perfectly still and listened to her own son through a cracked door. What Diane heard through that closet door, she repeated to me later, almost word for word, because she said she knew, even as it was happening, that she would need to remember every single sentence. Vanessa's voice came first, calm and businesslike. The kind of calm that comes from someone who has already made peace with something uncomfortable, she said. Once your dad signs the final writer next month, my father's firm can close out the transfer completely. After that, we won't need him involved in the day-to-day at all. Tyler's voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it, even through a wall. He said, I don't know, Van, this feels like a lot. He trusts me. Vanessa's response came quick and flat. He trusts you because you've never given him a reason not to. That's exactly why this works. My dad's firm structured it clean. The insurance writer language covers the transfer of decision-making authority. He thinks he's protecting the business in case something happens to him. He has no idea what he actually signed. There was a pause, and then Tyler said something. Diane says she will never forget as long as she lives. And once the shares are fully in my name, Vanessa answered without hesitation. Then we sell his stake to the group my dad already lined up, buy out the equipment, and you run it exactly the way you want, without him looking over your shoulder every single day. Diane sat frozen on that bed, the folder still opened across her knees. Listening to her son discuss selling away 32 years of my life like it was a line item on a spreadsheet. She said she felt something cold move through her chest, something she had never felt before in her life, not fear exactly, more like the floor of the world quietly dropping an inch beneath her feet. She closed the folder gently, placed it back on the dresser exactly as she'd found it, and walked out of that room on legs that barely felt like her own. I was standing near the pool, talking to one of Tyler's old college friends, when I felt Diane's hand close around mine. I turned and saw her face, and even now I can't fully describe what I saw there. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked in any way another guest could see, but her eyes had a kind of stillness I had only seen once before. The day her father passed away. The look of someone holding an enormous weight perfectly steady so it doesn't spill. She leaned in close to my ear over the music and the laughter around us, and she said, "Have to go." I asked her why right there with a drink still in my hand and Tyler's friend still mid-sentence beside me. She didn't answer. She just squeezed my hand tighter and started walking toward the door, pulling me gently but firmly along with her, the way you'd guide someone away from something dangerous without wanting to alarm them. I said her name once, quietly confused, but she just shook her head slightly, a small motion that told me to wait, to trust her, to not ask again in front of anyone. We found Tyler near the kitchen island, and Diane told him, in a voice so steady I still don't know how she managed it, that I wasn't feeling well and we needed to head home. Tyler's face flickered with something, concern maybe, or something closer to alarm, and he asked if everything was okay a little too quickly, a little too carefully. Vanessa appeared beside him within seconds, her smile fixed perfectly in place, telling us how sorry she was. We had to leave early, hoping I felt better soon. Diane thanked her warmly, hugged Tyler goodbye, and steered me toward the front door with her hands still locked around mine, walking past the valley, past the row of expensive cars, out into the June afternoon sun, where the air suddenly felt cooler than it had all day. We walked to our car in near silence, past a driveway full of vehicles that probably cost more combined than my first house. I opened the passenger door for Diane out of habit, and she got in without a word, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I climbed into the driver's seat and looked over at her, and she just shook her head slightly again, glancing toward the house behind us, where Tyler and Vanessa still stood near the front door, watching us go. I started the engine, but didn't pull out of the driveway right away. I asked her again, quieter this time, what was going on. She reached over and put her hand on my arm and said, "Not yet, Frank, drive first." So I backed out slowly, careful not to clip the row of parked cars, and pulled out onto Windsor Court, watching in the rearview mirror as the big stone house got smaller behind us. We drove in complete silence for almost 10 minutes. I didn't push her. 33 years of marriage teaches you when your wife needs a minute to find her words, and I could see in the tight line of her jaw that whatever she needed to say was going to be heavy. The radio was still on low from the drive over. Some song I didn't recognize, and I finally reached over and turned it off because the silence between us suddenly felt like it needed room to breathe. We pulled into a grocery store parking lot about halfway home, and I put the car in park without even really deciding to. Something told me we weren't going anywhere else until this conversation happened. Diane turned in her seat to face me fully for the first time since we'd left the party. Her hands folded tightly in her lap, and I remember thinking, right before she spoke, that I had never seen my wife look quite so afraid of saying something out loud. Diane looked at me for a long moment before she finally spoke. "Frank," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." I told her, of course, whatever it was. She took a breath and asked, "You didn't actually see it, did you? The paperwork Gordon's firm sent over last year, the insurance writer Tyler asked you to sign. You didn't actually read it, did you? You just trusted him and signed it." I sat there in that grocery store parking lot, and something in my stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence, because I already knew the answer. Tyler had come by the shop last October with a folder from Gordon's law firm, told me it was routine insurance paperwork, something about liability coverage in case anything happened to me, protecting the business for the family. I remembered signing it in maybe 2 minutes, standing at the counter, barely glancing past the first page because my son handed it to me and told me it was nothing to worry about. I told Diane slowly that no, I hadn't really read it. I trusted him. She closed her eyes for a second, like she'd been hoping I would tell her something different. Then she told me everything. The closing statement with the real price of the house, the folder with my company's name on it, the power of attorney document with my signature that I apparently never fully understood I was signing. And then, word for word as best she could remember, what she heard through that closet door, Vanessa's voice explaining calmly how the transfer worked, how I had no idea what I'd actually signed, and Tyler's voice asking him what happens after, and Vanessa answering that they would sell my stake to a group her father had already arranged. I sat completely still behind the wheel of that car, my hands still resting on it, even though the engine was off, and for a long moment I couldn't say a single word. 32 years of my life and my own son had been quietly signing it away to strangers, while I stood in his backyard, holding a drink and feeling proud. We drove home mostly in silence after that, and I don't remember much of the actual drive, just the blur of familiar streets going by while my mind replayed that October afternoon over and over. Tyler standing at my shop counter, folder in hand, telling me it was routine, me signing without reading, because that's what you do for your son, because that's what trust looks like when you've spent your whole life building it. That night, after Diane had gone up to bed, I sat alone in my home office with a desk lamp on and pulled out the small fireproof filing box where I kept important papers. I dug through old tax documents, insurance policies, warranty papers on the truck, until I found it, a thin manila folder from October. The one Tyler had dropped off. I hadn't even filed it properly. I just tossed it in there and forgotten about it. The way you forget about something you never thought mattered. I sat there at nearly midnight, reading through pages I should have read 8 months earlier. The language was dense, full of legal terms I didn't fully understand. Phrases like durable power of attorney and fiduciary discretion regarding business assets. Buried on page 4, in a paragraph that looked almost identical to the surrounding insurance language, was a clause granting the attorney, in fact, Tyler, the authority to execute transfers of ownership interest in Sullivan Plumbing and Heating under certain conditions. I read that paragraph probably a dozen times. My hands weren't shaking from anger yet, not that night. They were shaking from something closer to disbelief. The feeling of realizing a door you thought was locked had actually been standing wide open the entire time. I sat there until nearly 2 in the morning, staring at my own signature at the bottom of a page that had quietly handed away 32 years of my life, wondering how many other things I had trusted without ever really looking. The next morning, I called my longtime lawyer and friend, a man named Carl Bennett, who had handled the paperwork for my business since the very first year I opened it. Carl had known me longer than Diane had, back when I was still running service calls out of a rusted van with a magnetic sign on the door. I told him I needed to see him first thing, that it couldn't wait, and something in my voice must have told him this wasn't about a routine tax question. I sat across from Carl at his office a little before 9 that morning and slid the October folder across his desk. He read through it slowly, his face going flatter and more serious with every page. The way a man's face changes when he realizes a friend is in real trouble. When he got to page 4, he stopped, read it twice, and looked up at me over his glasses. "Frank," he said, "this isn't a standard insurance writer. This is a durable power of attorney with specific business transfer authority. Whoever drafted this buried the actual grant of authority inside language, designed to look routine. This is not something a good faith law firm writes by accident." I asked him what that meant for me right now today, and he told me plainly. Under this document, Tyler currently had the legal standing to begin transferring ownership shares of my company, and depending on how far along things already were, we might be racing against a clock we didn't even know was ticking. Pulled out his phone right there and called the county recorder's office while I sat in that chair feeling 32 years of my life narrowed down to the next few hours. He confirmed no transfer had been formally recorded yet, which meant we still had time, but not much of it. I remember sitting there, thinking about Tyler as a boy sweeping the floor of my first shop and feeling something break quietly inside my chest that had nothing to do with the business at all. Carl and I spent that entire day working quietly and carefully, because the last thing either of us wanted was for Tyler or Vanessa's father to sense anything was wrong before we were ready. We drafted a formal revocation of the power of attorney and filed it with the county that same afternoon, along with a notarized statement confirming I had never knowingly granted authority to transfer business ownership. Carl also reached out to my accountant, Marlene, a woman who had handled my books for almost 15 years, and had her freeze any pending transfers connected to the business accounts. I called Diane from Carl's office and told her what we were doing. And she was quiet for a moment before she said something I've thought about many times since. "Frank, I'm not sorry I looked in that room. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I would rather you be angry at me for looking than lose everything you built because I walked past it." I told her there was nothing to be sorry for at all. She had saved something I didn't even know was in danger. By the end of that day, the power of attorney was formally revoked. The business accounts were secured, and Carl had a paper trail, ready showing exactly when I had filed to protect myself. The moment we discovered the truth, we agreed I wouldn't call Tyler that night. Not out of spite, but because I needed to be calm before I spoke to my own son about something this serious, and calm wasn't something I could fake yet. I sat on my back porch that evening, long after Diane had gone inside, looking out at the yard where Tyler used to play catch with me as a boy, trying to understand how a person grows from that little boy into someone who sits in a closet discussing selling off his father's life's work like a piece of furniture. I didn't have an answer that night. I just knew I needed to face him with the truth instead of my temper.
My grandfather left me an empire worth $10 billion, but my family thought they could bully me into giving it all away. When I refused, my own parents threw my belongings onto the lawn in the pouring rain. They thought they had won. They thought a simple forensic accountant could not fight back against a ruthless hedge fund manager and a family of Manhattan elites. But when they showed up at my New Hamptons estate with armed guards to force my hand, the smug smiles melted right off their faces. Because the people standing behind me were not butlers or security guards. They were federal agents with handcuffs. My name is Cassidy, 33 years old, and for my entire life I was the black sheep of the Maxwell family. While they obsessed over country clubs and designer labels, I built a quiet career tracing hidden money and exposing financial fraud. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your family underestimate your intelligence and treat you like you do not belong. It had been exactly 3 days since my grandfather, Theodore Maxwell, died in a horrific car crash on the Long Island Expressway. He was the founder of Maxwell Holdings, a self-made billionaire who built a massive real estate and investment empire entirely from scratch. He was also the only person in our family who ever showed me genuine affection. We were sitting in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Attorney Montgomery, my grandfather's longtime legal counsel in downtown Manhattan. The reading of the will was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, but the atmosphere in the room felt less like a mourning period and more like a lottery celebration. My mother Beatrice sat at the head of the long table adjusting her diamond necklace and sipping sparkling water. She was wearing a black designer dress that looked more suited for a fashion gala than a period of grieving. Next to her sat my father Richard, tapping his expensive leather shoes impatiently against the floor while checking stock prices on his phone. But the truly sickening display was happening right across from me. My older sister Vanessa, the undisputed golden child of the Maxwell family, was huddled over an iPad with her husband Jamal. Jamal was a slick, smooth-talking hedge fund manager, a black man with a penchant for custom-tailored Italian suits and a ruthless reputation on Wall Street. Together, they were actively scrolling through a catalog of luxury yachts. "I like the sun deck on the 80-footer," Vanessa giggled, pointing at the screen with a perfectly manicured nail. But maybe we should go up to the 100-foot model. We are going to need the extra space for entertaining in Monaco this summer. Jamal leaned back in his leather chair, exuding absolute arrogance. Go for the 100-footer, babe. He flashed a $1 million smile that did not reach his cold eyes. The old man is leaving us $10 billion. We are not playing in the minor leagues anymore. I am going to double that money in my fund by next year anyway. I sat quietly in my modest gray suit, my hands folded tightly in my lap. My chest ached with a raw, suffocating grief. My grandfather was barely in the ground, and here they were dividing his life's work like scavengers picking at bones. He had taught me how to read financial statements when I was 12. He had encouraged me to get my accounting degree, telling me that knowing how money moves is the only way to know the truth about people. He was the only one who understood why I wanted to work for a living instead of riding on the family coattails. Is there any reason we are whispering about this? Beatrice suddenly spoke up, her sharp voice cutting through the quiet hum of the air conditioning. It is our money now. Theodore is gone. We should be planning the future of Maxwell Holdings. Richard nodded in agreement without looking up from his phone screen. Jamal is right. With that kind of capital injection, Jamal can finally expand his hedge fund operations globally, and Vanessa can launch that luxury lifestyle brand she has been talking about. I looked at my family, feeling entirely disconnected from their reality. You do realize we are here to read his will, right? I asked, my voice steady but tight with restrained emotion. He just died. Could you at least pretend to have an ounce of respect for him? The room went dead silent. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward me, filled with a mixture of annoyance and pure disdain. Beatrice scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. Oh, please, Cassidy, spare us the self-righteous act. We all know you are just bitter because you chose a boring dead-end career. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a checkbook, and quickly scribbled something down with a gold fountain pen. She ripped the check from the pad and tossed it across the polished wooden table. It fluttered and landed right in front of me. I looked down. It was a check for $10,000. What is this? I asked flatly. That is for the funeral expenses and whatever cheap catering you want to organize, Beatrice said, waving her hand dismissively. Take it and leave. There is no point in you sitting here for the reading of the will. Vanessa smirked, leaning her chin on her hand. Mom is right, Cassidy. Grandpa always hated how stubborn you were. You refused his help for college, you refused to work for his company, and you became a glorified bean counter. Do you honestly think he left anything to a penny-counting auditor who makes $80,000 a year? Jamal chuckled, adjusting his gold Rolex watch. Let us be real, Cassidy. You trace missing receipts for a living. You do not understand how real wealth operates. This table is for the people who are going to run the Maxwell empire. Take the 10 grand. Buy yourself a nicer suit. Go back to your cubicle and let the adults handle the big boy money. I stared at the check, then looked up at my mother. You are trying to pay me to leave my own grandfather's will reading. You are a disruption, Richard chimed in, his tone dripping with condescension. You have always been a disruption. You never fit into our social circles. You never made an effort to understand our world. Theodore might have indulged your independence, but he was a businessman first. He knew who had the pedigree to inherit this family's legacy. It certainly is not you. I slowly picked up the check. The paper felt heavy, not with value, but with the sheer weight of their entitlement. They had spent my entire life making me feel small, treating my choice to build an independent, honest career as a personal insult to their inherited wealth. They truly believed that because I did not wear designer labels or attend elite charity galas, I was somehow invisible to the man who built the very fortune they were drooling over. Jamal leaned across the table, his dark eyes locking onto mine with predatory amusement. Look, little sister, I will even be generous. Once the estate clears and I take over the investment portfolio, I will throw $1 million into a trust for you. Just enough so you never have to bother us again. Just sign whatever waivers Attorney Montgomery hands out today, and you can walk away a millionaire. Not bad for a girl who stares at spreadsheets all day, right? I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply took the $10,000 check between my thumbs and index fingers and tore it cleanly down the middle. Then I tore it again. I placed the shredded pieces in a neat little pile in the center of the table. "I am staying right here," I said, my voice eerily calm. Beatrice gasped, her face flushing red with anger. "How dare you!" Before she could launch into another tirade, the heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open. Attorney Montgomery stepped in carrying a thick leather binder. His face was grave, his eyes tired. "Good morning, everyone," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I apologize for the delay. The paperwork for an estate of this magnitude requires absolute precision." Jamal grinned, sitting up straight and adjusting his tie. "No problem at all, Montgomery. We are all eager to get down to business and start securing Theodore's legacy. Let us hear it." Montgomery opened the binder. The silence in the room returned, but this time it was electric thick with the anticipation of unimaginable wealth. I kept my eyes locked on the shredded check in front of me, bracing myself for whatever my grandfather had decided. Attorney Montgomery adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the heavy parchment paper. He began with the standard legal declarations, affirming that Theodore Maxwell was of sound mind and body when this document was drafted exactly 14 days prior to the fatal car accident. My father Richard leaned forward, practically vibrating with greed. Montgomery spent the first agonizing 10 minutes listing off my grandfather's charitable donations. $50 million to a pediatric hospital in Boston, $20 million to an urban development initiative in Detroit, $10 million to various animal rescue foundations across New York State. With every million announced, I could see Vanessa shifting restlessly in her plush leather chair. She sighed heavily, twisting a massive diamond ring around her finger. Jamal patted her knee, whispering loud enough for me to hear that $50 million was nothing but a strategic tax write-off for an estate of this magnitude. They were indulging the dead man's philanthropy, waiting impatiently for the main course to be served. They genuinely believed the charity was just pocket change before the real wealth was handed over to them. Montgomery turned a page. The crisp sound of the thick paper seemed to echo loudly in the cavernous room. He paused, removing his glasses for a brief second, to wipe the lenses with a microfiber cloth. He was stalling. He knew the absolute chaos that was about to unfold within these four walls. He placed the glasses back on his face and cleared his throat. "We now come to the specific bequests regarding the immediate family," Montgomery said, his voice dropping an octave. Beatrice sat up perfectly straight, a triumphant, glowing smile blooming on her face. Jamal crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back like a king preparing to receive the keys to his new kingdom. Montgomery read directly from the page. "To my daughter Beatrice Maxwell, to my son-in-law Richard Maxwell, to my eldest granddaughter Vanessa, and to her husband Jamal, I leave the sum of one single United States dollar each." The room froze solid. For a span of 10 seconds, nobody took a breath. The central air conditioning hummed softly in the background, amplifying the sudden crushing silence. Jamal let out a short, sharp laugh, shaking his head as he uncrossed his arms. "Right, right," Jamal said, waving his hand dismissively at the lawyer. "That is the standard legal phrasing to prevent us from contesting the will later. It just means the main assets are wrapped up in the corporate trust structure. Go on, Montgomery. Skip the formalities. Get to the executive voting rights and the offshore portfolios." Montgomery did not smile. He did not nod. He looked Jamal dead in the eye with the icy, unwavering professionalism of a man who billed $1,000 an hour and tolerated zero disrespect. "That is not a placeholder," Jamal Montgomery said flatly. "That is the entirety of your inheritance. $1. The will explicitly stipulates that a physical $1 bill is to be handed to each of you upon my reading of this document to ensure there is no legal ambiguity regarding Theodore's intent. He did not forget to include you in his estate planning. He actively chose to leave you nothing else." Vanessa gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Beatrice's triumphant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, sickly mask of utter confusion. Richard gripped the edge of the mahogany table so intensely, his knuckles turned pure white. "What are you talking about?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and shaking with sudden panic. Where is the rest of it? Where is Maxwell Holdings? Where is the Hamptons property? Montgomery looked back down at the binder. I will read your father's exact words, Beatrice. Please do not interrupt me again. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The entirety of my remaining estate, including 100% of all voting and non-voting shares in Maxwell Holdings, all liquid capital across domestic and international banking institutions, the primary residential estate located in the Hamptons, and all associated physical assets, artwork, and vehicles. I leave solely, exclusively, and irrevocably to my granddaughter, Cassidy Maxwell. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that sucked the oxygen straight out of the room. The smug, arrogant energy that had filled the conference space just moments ago was entirely obliterated, crushed under the weight of those final words. I sat frozen in my chair, my heart slamming violently against my ribs. $10 billion, an entire global corporate empire, the sprawling Hamptons estate, all of it, to me. As a forensic accountant, my brain immediately tried to process the sheer scale of those numbers, but the reality was too massive to compute. My grandfather had not just given me wealth, he had handed me the ultimate weapon. Montgomery continued reading my grandfather's final message, his steady voice echoing in the dead quiet. I leave this empire to the only person in this family who understands the true value of a dollar, the grueling labor required to earn it, and the absolute integrity required to protect it. Cassidy has never asked me for a handout. She has built her life on truth and diligence. I trust her forensic mind to clean up the rot that has infected certain branches of my legacy. She is my sole heir. Montgomery closed the thick leather binder with a definitive, echoing thud. The physical shift in my family was a magnificent spectacle of human greed collapsing in on itself. Jamal's custom-tailored Italian suit suddenly seemed too tight for him. He stared at me, his dark eyes wide and bloodshot, his jaw literally unhinged. The confident, ruthless Wall Street predator had been reduced to a gaping, paralyzed statue. Vanessa dropped her iPad. It clattered harshly against the hardwood floor, the glass screen shattering loudly, but she did not even look down to check the damage. She just stared at me with pure, unadulterated horror, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. Beatrice looked like she was about to physically vomit. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a raspy, breathless wheeze came out. All her elitist posturing, all her country club arrogance wiped out by a single legal document. Richard looked back and forth between me and Montgomery, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The transition from absolute entitlement to complete devastating shock was total. They had walked into this room expecting to become billionaires, and they were walking out with a $1 bill. The deafening silence lasted only a moment before the shockwave hit. The explosion of anger was instantaneous and violent. Richard slammed both of his fists down onto the polished mahogany table with such force that the crystal water glasses rattled, spilling ice water across the expensive wood surface. "This is a total fraud," Richard roared, his face contorting into an ugly mask of rage. "You forged this document. Or worse, you manipulated him." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. My father was 82 years old. He was slipping. His mind was not right. And you opportunistic little parasite, you used your forensic accounting tricks to confuse a senile old man into signing away his entire empire. Beatrice shrieked, finally finding her voice as she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. "Richard is exactly right," she yelled, leaning over the table. "You isolated him. You filled his head with lies about our investments and our lifestyle. You think we do not know what you do for a living. You dig up financial dirt. You probably manufactured some fake report to make us look bad, so he would rewrite the will in your favor. I am his only daughter. This wealth is my birthright. I carried you for 9 months, and this is how you repay me, by stealing my legacy." I sat perfectly still, letting their unhinged accusations wash over me. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not raise my voice to defend myself. The irony of their words was rich. Theodore Maxwell possessed a sharper mind at 82 than Richard and Beatrice combined. He had never been senile. He simply started paying closer attention to the family ledger, and he asked me to verify the terrifying discrepancies he found. I did not manufacture anything. The math did all the talking. But I was not about to explain my forensic audits to them in this boardroom. Seeing that screaming was getting them nowhere, Jamal decided it was time to deploy his Wall Street negotiation tactics. He stood up, adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket, and walked slowly around the large table. He positioned himself deliberately between my chair and the heavy oak exit doors, using his tall, broad frame to block my path. It was a classic intimidation maneuver, a physical threat designed to make me feel small, helpless, and completely cornered. "Let us all take a breath and approach this rationally," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a smooth, dangerously calm register. He leaned over my chair, placing his large hands heavily on the armrest to physically box me in. I could smell his expensive cologne, sharp and overpowering, attempting to suffocate my personal space. "Cassidy, listen to me very carefully," he continued, a predatory smile returning to his face. "You are playing a very dangerous game and you are entirely out of your depth. You are a low-level auditor. You review tax returns and catch minor embezzlement for mid-sized companies. You make, what, $80,000 a year? After taxes and your rent in the city, you are basically living paycheck to paycheck. You take the subway, you carry a cheap briefcase, you do not have the legal muscle, the capital, or the sheer stamina to fight a war over a $10 billion estate." He leaned his face closer to mine, dropping his voice to a whisper, meant only for me to hear. "If we take this to probate court, my legal team will tie this inheritance up for a decade. We will freeze every single asset. You will drown in legal fees before you ever see a single dime of this money. You will be bankrupt by Christmas." He pulled back slightly, spreading his hands in a gesture of fake benevolence. "So here is what is going to happen. You are going to sign a legal document right now renouncing your claim to this estate and citing Theodore's diminished mental capacity. In exchange for saving my family, the headache of a drawn-out court battle, I will personally write you a check today for $1 million. Tax-free. That is more money than you will see in a lifetime of crunching numbers in your sad little cubicle. You take the million, you go buy yourself a nice little house in the suburbs, and you leave the global finance to the people who actually know how to wield power." Vanessa, having recovered from her initial shock, quickly chimed in from across the table, her voice dripping with venom. "Take the deal, Cassidy. You do not belong in our world. You never have. Jamal is being incredibly generous to offer you anything at all. If you fight us on this, we will absolutely crush you. We will make sure you lose your job, your professional reputation, and every penny you think you are entitled to. Just sign the papers and go back to your miserable little life." I looked up at Jamal. He was towering over me, waiting for me to crack. He expected tears. He expected fear. He expected the quiet, overlooked sister to bow her head, succumb to his aggressive posturing, and accept the crumbs falling from his table. Instead, my forensic mind was actively analyzing their behavior. This level of extreme panic, the immediate leap to threats, the desperation to secure the assets today, it all confirmed what my grandfather and I had suspected. Jamal was not just greedy, he was running out of time. He needed billions of dollars immediately to cover a massive bleeding hole in his own hedge fund. I slowly reached down for my leather briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. I lifted it onto my lap and pulled the zipper closed with a sharp, definitive sound. I stood up, forcing Jamal to take a rapid half-step back to avoid a physical collision. I was significantly shorter than him, but in that moment, I did not yield a single inch of ground. I looked him dead in the eye. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the absolute, unshakable certainty of my position radiate through the room. "No." The single word hung in the air, sharp and heavy as an anvil. Jamal's confident, predatory smirk faltered, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Excuse me," I said. "No." I repeated, my tone utterly flat and devoid of any emotion. "I am not taking your $1 million. I am not signing away my grandfather's legacy, and I am certainly not intimidated by a man whose hedge fund is currently bleeding capital faster than he can legally cover it up." Jamal's face drained of color, his jaw locked tightly. The sudden calculated mention of his financial bleeding hit a nerve he thought was perfectly hidden from the world. Before he could recover his composure or attempt another physical threat, I stepped around him with deliberate, measured steps. I turned back to face my parents and my sister one last time as I reached the door handle. "You have your dollar," I said calmly, looking directly at my mother's horrified face. "Spend it wisely." Without waiting for another word, I walked straight out. Behind me, the conference room erupted into absolute unhinged chaos. Beatrice began screaming my name, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. Richard was shouting threats of endless lawsuits and total destruction, his voice echoing violently off the mahogany walls. Vanessa was sobbing in absolute rage, demanding that Jamal do something to physically stop me. I did not look back. I stepped out into the quiet, thickly carpeted hallway of the law firm and let the heavy oak doors click shut behind me, sealing their frantic, greedy screams inside. The elevator ride down to the street level was the quietest 60 seconds I had experienced all week. The adrenaline from the boardroom was still rushing through my veins, but my mind was already shifting into high gear, calculating the logistical steps I needed to take. I had been staying at my parents' Manhattan townhouse for the past 4 days to help organize my grandfather's memorial service. I needed to get back there, grab my travel bags, and figure out my next move. The sky above New York City was already darkening, heavy gray clouds rolling in off the Atlantic. By the time my taxi navigated through the afternoon traffic and pulled up to the curb outside their pristine, multi-million-dollar townhouse, a torrential downpour had begun. I paid the driver and stepped out into the freezing rain, pulling my coat tight around my shoulders. I did not even make it to the front gate before I stopped dead in my tracks. My belongings were not inside waiting for me to pack. They were scattered across the meticulously manicured front lawn. 2 of my suitcases had been thrown with such force that the zippers had burst open. My blouses, my work skirts, my shoes, and my personal toiletries were soaking wet, plastered against the muddy grass. A silk dress I had bought with my very first accounting paycheck was tangled in a rose bush, ruined by the thorns and the mud. A framed photograph of me and my grandfather, one of the few possessions I brought with me for comfort during the funeral, lay shattered on the cobblestone walkway. I looked up. Beatrice stood perfectly dry under the grand covered portico of the townhouse entrance. Richard stood right behind her, his arms crossed over his chest, his face set in a hard, unforgiving scowl. They had beaten me here. Jamal must have arranged a private car to speed them back from the law firm, just so they could orchestrate this petty theatrical display of power. They wanted to beat me to the punch to show me that I was entirely at their mercy in their territory. "Is this supposed to frighten me?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy sound of the falling rain. Beatrice took a step closer to the edge of the porch, making sure the rain did not touch her designer shoes. "This is your reality check, Cassidy," she spat, her voice echoing loudly in the street. "You think a piece of paper from a dead man makes you powerful? You are nothing. You have no home here. You have no family here. I brought you into this world and I can just as easily erase you from it." I stood in the downpour, letting the cold water run down my face and soak my hair. I did not move to gather my things. I simply stared at the woman who was supposed to be my mother. "If you walk away from this house right now, without signing over those estate papers, you are dead to me," Beatrice screamed over the rising wind. "Do you hear me? Dead. We will block you from every social circle. We will make sure you are blacklisted from every financial firm in this city. You will be living on the streets before the month is over. But if you come inside right now, beg for our forgiveness, and hand over the rights to Jamal, we will let you pack a dry bag and give you enough money to crawl back to your miserable apartment." This was the classic Maxwell family playbook. Isolate, humiliate, and terrorize until the target breaks. They had used this exact tactic on me when I was a teenager to try and force me into their preferred mold. They expected me to fall to my knees. They expected me to cry, to apologize, to scramble in the mud to save my ruined clothes, and then beg for shelter from the storm. But I did not shed a single tear. The forensic accountant inside my brain was entirely detached, processing this scene as pure data. My parents were not acting out of strength. They were acting out of absolute, unadulterated panic. Throwing my clothes onto the lawn was not a display of power. It was the frantic flailing of people who realized they had lost control of the board. They needed those papers signed immediately, which meant they were terrified of what would happen if I actually took possession of the estate. I walked slowly toward the shattered picture frame on the cobblestones. I knelt down, ignoring the mud soaking into my gray suit trousers. I carefully picked up the photograph of me and my grandfather, brushing a piece of broken glass off his smiling face. I tucked it safely into the inside pocket of my dry leather briefcase. That was the only thing on this lawn that actually mattered to me. I stood back up. I did not shout. I did not hurl insults. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and wiped the rainwater off the screen. I opened my ride-sharing app and selected an Uber Black. "What are you doing?" Richard barked from the porch, his authoritative posture faltering slightly at my total lack of hysteria. "Did you not hear your mother pick up your trash and get out of our sight?" "I am booking a ride," I replied evenly, my eyes focused on the screen. "And I am leaving the trash right where it is. You can pay your housekeeper to clean up your mess." Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "A ride to where your cramped little rental in the city. Good luck paying your rent when Jamal freezes your bank accounts by tomorrow morning." I looked up from my phone, locking eyes with my mother through the curtain of heavy rain. "I am not going back to my rental, Beatrice." A sleek black luxury SUV rounded the corner and glided smoothly to a halt right at the curb beside me. The driver stepped out, opening an umbrella, ready to assist me with the bags scattered on the grass. I raised my hand to stop him. "Leave the bags," I told the driver. "I will not be needing them." I walked toward the open door of the SUV, then paused and looked back at my parents. They were staring at me, bewildered by my absolute calm. The satisfying realization that their ultimate punishment had completely failed to break me was beginning to register on their faces. "Where are you going?" Beatrice demanded, her voice losing its venom, replaced by a sudden creeping anxiety. I slid into the plush leather seat of the SUV and looked out the window at them. "I am going home," I said clearly. "To my $10 billion estate in the Hamptons. Do not ever contact me again." I pulled the heavy car door shut. As the driver put the vehicle into gear and pulled away from the curb, I looked through the rain-streaked window. Beatrice and Richard were left standing on the porch, completely frozen, staring at the empty space where I had just been. They had intended to leave me homeless and broken in the rain. Instead, they had just watched me walk away with a multi-billion-dollar empire without shedding a single tear. The war had officially begun, and they had just handed me all the motivation I needed to finish it. The 2-hour drive east from Manhattan to the Hamptons gave me time to dry off and let the adrenaline settle into cold focus. The rain battered against the tinted windows of the luxury SUV, but inside the climate control hummed a steady, quiet rhythm. When we finally turned onto the private coastal road, the massive wrought iron gates of my grandfather's estate loomed ahead in the darkness. I rolled down my window, ignoring the freezing rain, and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner mounted on the stone pillar. A tiny green light flashed. The heavy metal gates swung open smoothly. The driver navigated the long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees until the massive stone facade of the mansion came into view. I thanked him, stepped out into the storm, and unlocked the heavy front doors. I stepped into the grand foyer and locked the doors behind me. The silence inside the mansion was absolute. It was a sprawling 30-room estate that usually bustled with groundskeepers and private chefs during the summer months, but tonight it was entirely empty. I reached out and flipped the master switch. A series of crystal chandeliers illuminated the massive marble entryway, casting a warm golden glow over the sweeping double staircase. My wet shoes squeaked slightly against the pristine stone floor. I was freezing, my suit was ruined, and I had exactly 0 physical luggage to my name. Yet standing in the center of a property worth more than most people could earn in 100 lifetimes, I had never felt more secure. This was not just a house, it was a fortress. And it was mine. I walked slowly down the long eastern corridor, my fingertips trailing along the expensive silk wallpaper. Every corner of this house held a piece of Theodore Maxwell. Passing by the formal drawing room, my eyes landed on a worn, leather armchair near the massive stone fireplace. It was the exact spot where I had sat 10 years ago, gripping a stack of student loan documents. I remembered my grandfather trying to hand me a blank check to cover my tuition and my accounting certification exams. I had pushed the check back across the coffee table. I told him that if I took his money, Beatrice and Richard would spend the rest of my life claiming they bought my success. I needed to own my degree completely and entirely. My grandfather had looked at me with a sharp, piercing intensity that day. He slowly tore the blank check in half, nodded once, and told me that a forensic mind is useless without an incorruptible spine. That was the day the dynamic shifted. I stopped being just another grandchild and became the only person in the family he actually respected. At the end of the corridor, I pushed open the heavy double doors to his primary study. The room smelled faintly of his expensive cigars and old paper. The massive mahogany desk sat exactly as he left it, illuminated by the sudden flashes of lightning outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked around the desk and ran my hand over the leather writing pad. Sitting right in the center was a thick black leather-bound ledger. It was the private accounting book he used to track the family foundation. Seeing that ledger instantly pulled me back to a humid afternoon last August. Jamal had cornered my grandfather in this very room, aggressively pitching a massive capital injection for a new offshore hedge fund venture. Jamal was throwing around aggressive financial buzzwords promising triple-digit returns and sliding glossy spiral-bound pitch decks across this exact desk. After Jamal left the room, confident he had secured a massive investment, my grandfather had called me inside. He handed me the pitch deck and asked me to look at the math. It took my forensic training exactly 20 minutes to spot the rot. The revenue projections were artificially inflated. The liabilities were buried in a labyrinth of shell companies and mezzanine financing structures. The whole portfolio was structured exactly like a classic Ponzi scheme. I showed my grandfather the hidden debt traps. I showed him how Jamal was using new investor capital to pay off old returns, disguising phantom assets as legitimate revenue. When I circled the damning numbers with a red pen, my grandfather did not look angry. He looked terrified. I stood in the quiet study staring down at the black ledger. Theodore Maxwell had built an empire from the ground up. He knew how to spot a bad deal, but he had trusted his family. He had trusted Vanessa and her flashy, smooth-talking husband. When I proved that Jamal was siphoning money through ghost accounts, it broke my grandfather's heart, but it also woke him up. He realized the parasites were already inside the house. I pulled the heavy leather chair out and sat behind the mahogany desk. I opened the black ledger. The final pages were filled with my grandfather's frantic, cramped handwriting. There were long lists of routing numbers, dates of massive wire transfers that Jamal had authorized without permission. And at the very bottom of the last page, a single line written in red ink caught my eye. The combination is not in the numbers. It is in the blood. I closed the ledger, my pulse quickening as the realization washed over me. Theodore Maxwell was a paranoid, brilliant man. He would never leave the real evidence just lying on a desk where anyone could find it. He had hidden it securely. I stood up from the chair and turned to look at the massive oil paintings lining the walls of the study. The real battle was just beginning, and I needed to find the ammunition he had left behind for me. I slowly stepped away from the mahogany desk, my eyes scanning the perimeter of the dimly lit study. The phrase from the ledger echoed in my mind. The combination is not in the numbers, it is in the blood. My grandfather never spoke in riddles unless he was actively trying to bypass surveillance. He built his empire in an era where handshakes mattered, but he adapted to the digital age with a terrifying paranoia. He knew Jamal had access to his digital networks. He knew Beatrice would comb through his paper files. If he had hidden the ultimate proof of their financial crimes, it had to be somewhere physical, somewhere strictly locked away from the greedy hands of his own children. I approached the eastern wall of the study, which was lined with massive gold-framed oil paintings. Most of them were generic maritime landscapes, expensive but impersonal. I walked past a rendering of a 19th century clipper ship and a portrait of the original Maxwell Holdings office building. Then I stopped in front of a painting that felt entirely out of place. It was a simple, relatively unpolished portrait of my grandmother, the woman who passed away before I was born. My mother and sister hated this painting. They thought it looked cheap and clashed with the elite curated aesthetic of the Hamptons estate. They had repeatedly begged him to move it to the attic. He had fiercely refused. I stared at the portrait, remembering a quiet afternoon years ago. My grandfather had caught me admiring it and told me that blood and loyalty were the only two currencies that survived inflation. I reached out, pressing my palms against the heavy gilded frame. I pushed gently to the left. It did not budge. I applied upward pressure, then pulled slightly on the right edge. With a soft hydraulic hiss, the entire portrait swung outward on a set of concealed, heavy-duty hinges. Behind the canvas, carved directly into the original stone masonry of the mansion, was a sleek, matte black steel vault. It was a high-security safe, completely flush with the wall, lacking any visible keyhole dial or digital keypad. There was only a small recessed square of dark glass in the center, a biometric scanner. The combination is not in the numbers, it is in the blood. My breath caught in my throat as the sheer brilliance of his paranoia washed over me. He had not left a numeric code that Jamal could hack or Beatrice could guess. He had locked the truth behind a biological wall. But my grandfather was dead. His biometrics were gone, unless he had prepared for exactly this scenario. Unless he knew his time was running out. My hands were trembling slightly, still chilled from the freezing rain I had endured in Manhattan. I wiped my right index finger on the dry fabric of my ruined suit jacket to ensure there was no moisture. I took a deep breath, raised my hand, and pressed my thumb firmly against the dark glass square. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The silence in the study was absolute, save for the violent crashing of the storm against the windows behind me. My heart hammered against my ribs. If this did not work, the trail ended here. If he had not programmed my print into the master security system, I was sitting in a $10 billion fortress with no ammunition to fight the war that was coming to my doorstep by morning. Then the dark glass illuminated with a sharp blue scanning laser. The light swept across my thumbprint once, twice, and a third time. A small green light blinked at the top corner of the steel box. A heavy, satisfying mechanical clunk echoed from deep within the wall as the internal locking bolts retracted. The thick steel door popped open a fraction of an inch. I exhaled a long, shaking breath and pulled the heavy door fully open. The interior of the vault was lined with fireproof velvet. On the bottom shelf sat a neatly stacked pile of legal folders. I pulled the first one out and flipped it open. It contained the original notarized copies of the estate transfer, the absolute ironclad proof of my inheritance, signed by my grandfather and witnessed by a federal judge. These were the documents that would legally bulletproof my ownership of Maxwell Holdings. But as a forensic auditor, I knew that paperwork was just the shield. I needed the sword. I looked back into the safe. Sitting on the top shelf, resting on a small velvet display cushion, was a thick military-grade solid-state hard drive. It was encased in brushed titanium, the kind of hardware used by defense contractors to store classified data. Wrapped around the drive was a simple white index card. I reached in and picked up the heavy device. I slid the index card off and turned it over. My grandfather's handwriting stared back at me, sharp and deliberate. Cassidy, the card read. If you are reading this, it means I did not survive the cleanup. Jamal's offshore accounts are a house of cards, and he is using our family foundation to prop them up. I pulled the raw data before he could scrub the servers. The encryption key is the exact dollar amount of the first student loan payment you made by yourself. Burn them to the ground. I stood in the quiet study, gripping the cold titanium hard drive in my hand. The weight of what I was holding was staggering. This was not just a collection of spreadsheets and bank statements. This was the definitive, undeniable proof of massive financial fraud. My grandfather had not just died in a tragic accident. He had been eliminated because he found out what Jamal and my parents were doing, and he was gathering the evidence to expose them. They had orchestrated his death to cover their tracks, believing they could simply inherit his empire and use his billions to plug the bleeding holes in their own illegal schemes. They thought they had won. They thought getting rid of Theodore Maxwell meant their secrets were buried forever. They had no idea that he had passed the torch to the only person in the family equipped to dissect their financial crimes piece by piece. I walked back to the mahogany desk and powered up the high-end desktop computer sitting in the corner. I plugged the encrypted hard drive into the secure port. A password prompt immediately flashed on the screen demanding the decryption key. I did not even have to check my personal records. I knew that number by heart. It was the exact amount I had scraped together from working double shifts at a campus coffee shop, the first payment I made to ensure I owed my family absolutely nothing. I typed the numbers in and hit enter. The progress bar flashed green and the drive unlocked. A massive directory of folders populated the screen. Offshore wire transfers, shell company registrations, forged signature logs, and terrifying communication records. I sat down in my grandfather's leather chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark study. The forensic accountant took over completely. I cracked my knuckles and began to dig through the digital graveyard my grandfather had left me. I was going to find every single stolen dollar, every illegal wire transfer, and every lie they had ever told, and I was going to use it to rip their entire world apart. The raw data on the titanium drive was a massive tangled web of financial obfuscation. My grandfather had managed to download the core transaction logs from Jamal's servers, but raw logs are just noise without the right translation. I pulled my personal laptop from my briefcase, booted up my specialized forensic accounting suite, and bridged the connection via a secure encrypted cable. I imported the millions of rows of transaction data into a visualization mapping tool. I needed to see exactly how the blood flowed through this corrupt financial body. As the software processed the ledgers organizing routing numbers and offshore wire transfers, a horrifying picture began to render on my screen. This was not a case of simple mismanagement or a few bad market bets. Jamal had constructed a textbook Ponzi scheme scaled up to an institutional level. He had been promising his high-net-worth clients consistent double-digit returns in a volatile market. For the first 2 years, it looked like he was a Wall Street genius, but the math never lies. He was not generating actual profits. He was simply taking the massive capital injections from his newest investors and using them to pay the aggressive returns he had promised to his oldest clients. I ran a secondary script to isolate the funding streams. The screen lit up with a sprawling network of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Delaware. Jamal had layered the transactions, beautifully bouncing the money through dummy corporations to wash the origin before depositing it into the hedge fund's primary liquidity accounts. It was a sophisticated integration phase designed to fool standard tax audits. But forensic accounting looks for the gaps, the phantom yields that have no underlying asset generating the cash. Jamal had run out of new investors 6 months ago. The pyramid was collapsing, and he needed a massive influx of cash to keep his early investors from triggering a run on the fund. That was where my parents came in. I opened a folder labeled Foundation Transfers. My stomach churned as I read the authorization signatures on the digital PDF files. Richard and Beatrice Maxwell. My parents. They were the primary board members of the Maxwell Family Charitable Foundation, a tax-exempt entity my grandfather had funded with hundreds of millions of dollars meant for cancer research, housing development, and education grants. The documents showed that starting last October, my parents had authorized a series of emergency loans from the charitable foundation to a holding company named Vanguard Apex. I cross-referenced the holding company's tax identification number with Jamal's network. It was a direct pipeline. My parents had knowingly embezzled over $100 million from a federally registered charity to prop up their son-in-law's collapsing Ponzi scheme. They did not just turn a blind eye. They were fully complicit. They had actively participated in federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and the embezzlement of nonprofit funds. I stared at the digital signatures of the people who had raised me, The people who had thrown my clothes into the freezing rain just hours ago, telling me I was a worthless disappointment. They had draped themselves in designer clothes and country club elitism while literally stealing from dying children to finance their luxury yachts and vanity lifestyle brands. I dug deeper into the audit trails my grandfather had assembled. He had noticed the liquidity drain in the foundation during his quarterly review. Theodore Maxwell was old school. He did not confront them immediately. He hired private investigators and forensic data analysts to quietly shadow the money. He built an airtight case. He had compiled the bank routing numbers, the IP addresses used to authorize the illegal transfers, and the falsified K-1 schedules Jamal had been distributing to his wealthy victims. The depth of their betrayal was staggering. My parents had leveraged the Maxwell name to give Jamal credibility in elite circles. They had used my grandfather's pristine reputation to lure in new investors, effectively making the Maxwell family the face of a massive criminal enterprise. If the Securities and Exchange Commission or the FBI caught wind of this, without proper context, the entire Maxwell legacy would be destroyed. The federal government would freeze every asset, seize the properties, and drag my grandfather's name through the mud. That was why Theodore rewrote his will. He realized his own daughter and son-in-law were parasites preparing to bleed his empire dry to save themselves from federal prison. By leaving everything solely to me, a licensed forensic auditor, he was giving me the legal authority and the capital required to firewall the legitimate Maxwell businesses from Jamal's toxic hedge fund. He knew I was the only one ruthless enough and clean enough to sever the infected limb before it killed the host. I exported the most damning transaction logs and began compiling a master dossier. I organized the evidence into clear, undeniable categories: wire fraud, embezzlement, securities fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering. Every single file I dragged into the dossier was a nail in their collective coffin. The data mapping software had built an indisputable roadmap of their guilt, complete with timestamps and internal company communications where Richard and Jamal discussed covering up the missing foundation money. But as I reviewed the final batch of offshore transfers, I noticed an anomaly, a gaping, bleeding hole in Jamal's ledger that did not make sense. Even with the $100 million stolen from the charity, the numbers did not balance. Jamal had been making massive regular payments to an unlisted, unverified offshore entity. These were not returns paid to angry hedge fund clients. These were structured, aggressive wire transfers that bypassed standard banking protocols. They looked exactly like extortion. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in the dark study. The forensic puzzle was shifting rapidly. My family had not just stolen from a charity to keep up appearances. They were funneling millions into a black hole, and the entity on the receiving end was draining them dry. The sheer panic they displayed today, the desperation to force me to sign over a $10 billion estate, was not just about maintaining their lavish lifestyle or keeping the SEC off their backs. They were running for their lives. I just needed to find out who was chasing them. I sat back in the leather chair, staring at the financial labyrinth mapped out on my screen. The embezzlement was undeniable. The Ponzi scheme was a ticking time bomb. But as I scrubbed through the final batch of data, a chilling pattern emerged. The extortion payments Jamal was making, the millions funneled into that black hole, were timed perfectly with shifts in my grandfather's audit schedule. My grandfather was not just investigating Jamal's hedge fund. He was actively preparing to dismantle it. I opened a folder labeled Federal Communications. Inside were draft emails addressed to the Director of Enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the special agent in charge at the FBI's Economic Crimes Division in New York. The drafts detailed the fraudulent activity, the misappropriation of foundation funds, and explicitly named Jamal, Richard, and Beatrice as the primary architects. But there was something else, a subfolder titled The Cleanup. I clicked it open. It contained a series of encrypted voice memos recorded on my grandfather's personal dictaphone. I plugged in my headphones, my hands shaking slightly, and hit play on the most recent file dated just 3 days before his fatal accident. My grandfather's voice, raspy but terrifyingly lucid, filled my ears. "They know I've found it," he said, the audio crackling slightly. Richard tried to access the foundation accounts this morning. I blocked him. He called me panicked, talking about a liquidity crisis. Jamal is desperate. The cartel he's laundering for gave him a hard deadline. If he doesn't produce $50 million by the end of the month, they're going to make an example out of him and Vanessa. He begged me to unfreeze the foundation funds. I told him I was going to the SEC on Monday. I told him he was going to prison and I was going to make sure the Maxwell name survived the fallout. A heavy silence stretched on the recording before his voice returned lower and filled with a profound, crushing sorrow. Beatrice called me an hour later, my own daughter. She didn't apologize. She didn't beg. She told me that if I went to the feds, I would destroy the family. I told her the family was already destroyed. She said I was leaving them no choice. I stopped the recording. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive, leaving them no choice. I opened the next file, a PDF, containing a private investigator's report on a man named Elias Thorne. The report detailed Thorne's extensive criminal record, primarily involving vehicular sabotage and staged accidents for high-profile clients trying to collect insurance payouts. There was a bank routing number highlighted in red at the bottom of the page. I quickly ran that routing number through my forensic software, cross-referencing it with Jamal's offshore accounts. The match was instantaneous. 2 days before my grandfather's car careened off the Long Island Expressway, an offshore shell company controlled by Jamal wired $200,000 into an account linked to Elias Thorne. My stomach churned violently. It was not an accident. It was a hit. Jamal and my parents knew my grandfather was going to the feds on Monday. They knew the $50 million cartel deadline was looming. They realized they could not talk him out of it, and they could not access the foundation funds as long as he was alive and in control. So they paid a professional mechanic $200,000 to cut the brake lines on his vintage Aston Martin. They murdered him. They murdered my grandfather to silence him, to stop the SEC investigation, and to seize control of his $10 billion estate so they could pay off a cartel and continue funding their lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. The grief I had been suppressing since the funeral finally broke through, morphing instantly into a white-hot, consuming rage. They had not just stolen from a charity. They had not just humiliated me and thrown my belongings into the freezing rain. They had killed the only person in this family who ever loved me, the man who built the empire they were trying to steal. I looked at the digital trail mapping their guilt. It was an airtight case for murder conspiracy and massive financial fraud, but I also knew the reality of the American justice system. If I simply handed this hard drive to the local police, Jamal would hire an army of high-priced defense attorneys. They would tie up the evidence in jurisdictional disputes, claim the hard drive was tampered with, and drag the process out for years. Meanwhile, they would use the media to paint me as a disgruntled, estranged granddaughter trying to frame them for money. I needed a strike so precise, so overwhelmingly destructive, that they would have zero time to react. I needed to trap them in a situation where their own arrogance would be their undoing. I pulled up the draft emails my grandfather had prepared for the SEC and the FBI. He had laid the groundwork, but he hadn't pulled the trigger. I was going to finish what he started, but I was going to do it on my terms. I drafted a new email bypassing the general tips line and targeting a very specific contact I had cultivated during my years as a forensic auditor special agent, Marcus Keller, at the FBI's Economic Crimes Division. Keller was ruthless, efficient, and hated Wall Street fraudsters more than anyone I knew. I attached a highly condensed, undeniable summary of the Ponzi scheme, the foundation embezzlement, the cartel debt, and the wire transfer to Elias Thorne. I did not include the full hard drive I needed to keep the primary evidence secure until the trap was set. I typed a brief message, Agent Keller. The attached file details a multi-million-dollar fraud operation and a conspiracy to commit murder orchestrated by Jamal and Richard Maxwell. I have the primary evidence secured. They are currently attempting to seize a $10 billion estate to cover a $50 million cartel debt. I am setting a trap at the Maxwell Hamptons estate. I need a federal strike team, and I need them tomorrow morning. I hit send. The forensic accountant had gathered the data. Now it was time to orchestrate the execution. The exhaustion of this past 24 hours finally caught up with me. I closed the laptop, letting the quiet hum of the Hamptons estate lull me into a brief, dreamless sleep right there in my grandfather's leather chair. When I opened my eyes, pale morning light was filtering through the heavy rain clouds outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold gray dawn. I stretched my stiff muscles and walked to the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee, my mind already running through the checklist of tasks for the day. First on the agenda was securing funds to hire private security for the estate until the federal agents arrived. I pulled out my phone and opened my personal banking application to transfer a retainer fee. The screen loaded for a second before flashing a stark red error message. Access denied. Please contact customer service. I frowned, tapping the screen to refresh the page. The same error appeared. I switched to the application for my secondary checking account, the one I used for business expenses. It threw the exact same code. A cold sensation prickled at the base of my neck. I quickly navigated to the secure web portal Attorney Montgomery had set up for me yesterday afternoon, which contained the immediate liquidity trust funds from the Maxwell estate. I typed in my credentials, hit enter, and watched as a formal legal notice populated the screen. Account suspended. Pending judicial review. I set my phone down on the marble kitchen island, my forensic mind instantly dissecting the situation. A standard bank freeze takes days of bureaucratic red tape, and an estate freeze requires a legitimate challenge in probate court with significant evidence. They had bypassed the normal system entirely. I opened my laptop and bypassed my standard internet provider, using an encrypted virtual private network to access the public legal filings for the local county. It did not take long to find the trail. Jamal had not gone through federal channels or the legitimate Manhattan probate courts. He had used his dirty connections on Wall Street to find a corrupt local judge out in a neighboring jurisdiction. They had filed a highly irregular emergency ex parte injunction in the middle of the night. The legal filing was the masterpiece of character assassination. Jamal and my father had submitted sworn affidavits claiming that I was suffering from a severe, acute psychotic break brought on by the grief of my grandfather's sudden death. They alleged that I had violently threatened them during the reading of the will-destroyed property and was currently a danger to myself and the estate. They explicitly requested a temporary conservatorship and an immediate freeze on all financial assets to prevent me from recklessly liquidating the Maxwell empire in a state of clinical delirium. But Jamal did not stop at the courthouse. He knew an injunction could be overturned by noon if I got Montgomery involved. He needed to ensure the freeze stuck immediately. I checked my professional email and found a cascade of automated alerts from financial compliance officers. Jamal had weaponized his status as a high-profile hedge fund manager. He had personally contacted the risk management departments of the major banks, holding my grandfather's liquidity, leaking the fabricated court filing, and spinning a narrative about my supposed mental collapse. In the ultra-conservative world of institutional banking, the mere hint of a psychotic heir attempting to access billions of dollars triggers automatic, non-negotiable security lockdowns. The banks had slammed the vault doors shut to protect themselves from liability. My phone buzzed on the counter, shattering the quiet of the kitchen. A text message illuminated the lock screen. It was from Vanessa. I picked up the device and read the message. How does it feel to be a billionaire who cannot afford a cup of coffee? We told you to take the million, Cassidy. Now you get absolutely nothing. The sheriffs will be there soon to remove you from the property for your own safety. Do not make this harder than it has to be. I stared at the text message. The sheer audacity of her taunt was breathtaking. They truly believed they had cornered me. They thought stripping away my financial access would reduce me to a terrified, helpless victim, just like when I was a teenager dependent on their conditional allowance. They expected me to call them begging for a truce, pleading for access to my own money so I could buy food and hire a lawyer. They wanted me broken, compliant, and desperate. I did not reply to Vanessa. I simply set the phone face down on the counter. A slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. If I were a normal heir, this aggressive financial strangulation would be devastating. A normal person would panic, call their attorney in tears, and spend the next 48 hours trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare trying to lift the freeze while the family moved in for the kill. But Jamal and my family had made a fatal miscalculation. They were treating me like a naive heiress who only knew how to swipe a debit card. They forgot that I spent my entire career dismantling financial cages just like this one. They forgot that I tracked hidden money for a living. Freezing the localized public-facing accounts was a brilliant tactical move against an amateur, but Theodore Maxwell was no amateur, and neither was I. My grandfather had anticipated that his own family would try to legally suffocate the heir before the dust settled. He knew the domestic courts and the standard institutional banks could be manipulated by people with the right connections and enough money to bribe a judge. That was why the biometric safe did not just contain a hard drive with evidence of murder and embezzlement. It contained the key to an entirely different battlefield. Jamal thought he had locked me out of the war. He had no idea I was about to bypass his localized attack and drop a financial nuclear bomb on his entire operation. I walked back into the study, leaving my dead phone on the kitchen counter. It was time to open the real vault. I walked back into my grandfather's study and locked the heavy oak doors from the inside. The loud click of the deadbolt felt incredibly satisfying. Jamal thought freezing my domestic accounts was a brilliant checkmate. He truly believed he had cut off my oxygen supply and left me defenseless. He did not realize my grandfather had spent 50 years building a financial fortress designed specifically to withstand a siege from his own greedy offspring. I retrieved the titanium hard drive and the physical documents I had pulled from the biometric safe the night before. Beneath the stack of estate transfers lay a thin black leather notebook I had not yet examined closely. I opened it flat on the expansive mahogany desk. The crisp pages were filled with handwritten alphanumeric codes, internet protocol addresses, and routing numbers tied to banking institutions in Zurich, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore. This was Theodore Maxwell's ghost network. These were offshore shell companies completely insulated from the American judicial system and entirely immune to a forged local injunction from a corrupt county judge. I booted up my secondary forensic laptop, a machine I kept completely scrubbed of personal identifiers and equipped with military-grade encryption protocols. I established a secure connection through multiple proxy servers, masking my location to appear as if I were logging in from a corporate terminal in Geneva. I navigated to the portal of a highly exclusive Swiss private bank. The login screen did not ask for a username or a simple password. It asked for a sequence of secure token keys. I typed in the 12-digit alphanumeric code from the black notebook, followed by a secondary password my grandfather had memorized and passed down to me in a casual conversation years ago. The screen turned green. Access granted. The dashboard populated with a stunning array of decentralized trust accounts. I was looking at a reserve holding $50 million in completely liquid, untraceable capital. Jamal could freeze my checking account all he wanted. He could not touch a single cent of this. I immediately opened a secure payment gateway and wired a massive retainer fee to a private security firm based in New York City, authorizing them to deploy an armed perimeter team to the Hamptons estate within the hour. I was not going to let Jamal's hired thugs drag me out of my own house under the guise of a fake eviction notice. With my physical perimeter secured, I went to work transforming the elegant wood-paneled study into a forensic war room. I shoved the plush antique armchairs into the hallway to clear the floor space. I found a stack of large presentation whiteboards in a supply closet down the hall and dragged them into the room, setting them up in a wide semicircle around the mahogany desk. I connected my grandfather's high-speed laser printer and began printing out the most damning transaction logs from the titanium hard drive. The printer hummed continuously for a solid hour, spitting out hundreds of pages of bank statements, fake tax schedules, and encrypted email transcripts. I taped the documents to the whiteboards using a thick red dry erase marker to draw connecting lines between the various corporate entities. My forensic mind entered a state of absolute hyper-focused flow. I was no longer a grieving granddaughter or a rejected child. I was an apex predator in my natural habitat tracking prey that had left a massive bleeding trail of digital footprints. I mapped out the entire anatomy of Jamal's financial crimes, step by agonizing step. On the left whiteboard, I charted the Maxwell Family Charitable Foundation. I pinned up the authorization forms bearing the digital signatures of Richard and Beatrice. I drew a thick red line showing the $100 million my parents had embezzled, funneling it directly into Vanguard Apex Jamal's primary holding company. Seeing my parents' signatures on documents that actively stole money meant for pediatric cancer research extinguished any remaining flicker of sympathy I might have held for them. They were not just greedy, they were fundamentally corrupt. In the center of the room, I mapped the Ponzi scheme. I listed the names of his high net worth investors and traced how their new capital was being recycled to pay off fake dividends. I highlighted the exact dates where the legitimate revenue flatlined and the fraudulent payouts began. Jamal had constructed a beautiful, shiny facade, but the foundation was completely rotten. The data proved he was insolvent, running entirely on fumes and stolen charity funds. On the right whiteboard, I mapped the darkest, most dangerous corner of his empire, the $50 million cartel debt. I charted the offshore extortion payments, the frantic liquidations, and the desperate internal communications where Jamal begged for more time. Finally, right in the center of that board, I pinned the bank record showing the $200,000 wire transfer to Elias Thorne, the mechanic hired to cut my grandfather's brake lines. Standing back, I looked at the massive, interconnected web of fraud, theft, and murder surrounding me. The visual representation was terrifying in its sheer scope. They had built a criminal enterprise that infected every branch of the Maxwell legacy. But to me, it was a beautiful, undeniable roadmap to their complete destruction. Every red line I drew was a federal charge. Every document I pinned up was another nail in their collective coffin. They thought they were dealing with a naive girl who would panic at a frozen bank account. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a cage with a forensic auditor holding the keys to their complete annihilation. I picked up my red marker, capped it with a sharp snap, and turned back to my laptop. It was time to pull the trigger. I sat back down in front of my secondary laptop, my eyes fixed on the glowing screen. The broad strokes of the criminal enterprise were pinned to the whiteboards around me, but I needed the exact anatomical breakdown of the beast Jamal had foolishly invited into our family. A $50 million hole does not just appear overnight, even in a failing hedge fund. It takes deliberate, sustained exposure to highly toxic capital. I opened a specialized decryption tool and targeted the specific cluster of offshore accounts I had mapped on the right whiteboard. My grandfather had labeled this directory with a single word: quarantine. He knew this specific money was venomous. I isolated the routing numbers for the massive structured wire transfers Jamal had been making for the past 18 months. They were all funneled into a corporate entity registered in Cyprus under the name Obsidian Global. On paper, it looked like a standard private equity group investing in emerging markets. But my forensic software stripped away the corporate veil layer by layer. I bypassed the registered agents, dug through the intermediary holding companies in Panama, and finally hit the bedrock. Obsidian Global was not a private equity firm. It was a sophisticated money laundering syndicate directly operated by a notorious international cartel. A cold wave washed over me as the reality of Jamal's colossal arrogance sank in. He had not just defrauded wealthy socialites in Manhattan. In his desperation to maintain the illusion of his hedge fund's success, he had actively solicited capital from organized crime. He took dirty money, promised to wash it through his legitimate market investments, and guaranteed a clean, high-yield return. It was the ultimate pact with the devil. And when his Ponzi scheme began to collapse, he stopped generating returns. He started losing the cartel's money. You can stall an angry tech investor with a fake quarterly report. You cannot hand a fake spreadsheet to a cartel lieutenant. I navigated to a subfolder containing intercepted network traffic from Jamal's private server. My grandfather had utilized a shadow program to mirror Jamal's encrypted messaging application. I opened the chat logs. The transcripts were a terrifying descent into sheer animalistic panic. The messages from the Obsidian Global handler were sparse, chillingly polite, and undeniably lethal. At first, they simply asked for status updates on their yields. Then the tone shifted. 6 months ago, the messages demanded a full return of their initial $50 million principal. Jamal's responses were frantic, filled with pathetic excuses about market volatility and liquidity constraints. He begged for more time, promising exponential returns if they just gave him another quarter to reorganize his portfolio. The final message from the cartel was dated just 1 week ago. It was not a request, it was a death sentence. I read the transcript aloud, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We do not tolerate delays, Jamal. You have utilized our capital to fund your personal lifestyle. This is unacceptable theft. You have until Friday at midnight Eastern Standard Time to wire the full $50 million to the designated account. If the funds do not clear, we will not send lawyers. We will send our collection team to your residence. Your wife, Vanessa, will be held accountable alongside you. Do not test our resolve." I checked the calendar on my laptop. Friday at midnight. That was exactly 48 hours from now. The revelation hit me like a physical strike to the chest. The entire scene at Attorney Montgomery's office suddenly made perfect sense. The smug attitudes, the iPad browsing for luxury yachts, the arrogant laughter, it was all a desperate, meticulously constructed theatrical performance. Jamal and Vanessa were not casually planning a summer in Monaco. They were staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, sweating in sheer terror, putting on a brave face to ensure the lawyer suspected nothing. They needed my grandfather's $10 billion estate to unlock the $50 million in liquid cash required to save their own lives. When Montgomery announced that the entire empire belonged to me, he was not just cutting them out of a fortune, he was signing their death warrants. That was why Richard and Beatrice were so hysterical. That was why they had murdered my grandfather by cutting the brakes on his car. Theodore Maxwell was going to the federal authorities, which would have instantly frozen every single account tied to the family, including the foundation funds Jamal desperately needed to pay off the cartel. They killed the patriarch of our family not just out of greed, but out of pure, unadulterated survival instinct. They thought eliminating him would give them immediate control of the capital. Instead, he had bypassed them entirely and handed the keys to me. I stared at the chat logs, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. My sister and my parents were currently trapped in a burning building of their own making. If I signed over the estate papers, they would instantly wire the money to Cyprus, save themselves from the cartel, and then systematically destroy my life to ensure I could never expose them. If I held my ground, the cartel would execute Jamal and Vanessa by the weekend. A weaker person might have felt a surge of familial duty. A normal sister might have panicked, called the authorities to request protective custody for her siblings, or even considered handing over a fraction of the money to spare their lives. But I remembered the freezing rain hitting my face just hours ago. I remembered my ruined clothes scattered in the mud. I remembered Beatrice standing dry on the porch telling me I was dead to them. I remembered Vanessa texting me to mock my frozen bank accounts, reveling in her attempt to starve me out. They were facing execution by an international crime syndicate, and yet they still prioritized trying to emotionally and financially destroy me. They were venomous to the core. I was not going to save them. They had dug their own graves, and they had filled them with the stolen money of cancer patients and the blood of my grandfather. I was simply going to ensure that when the hammer fell, it fell exactly where I wanted it to, and the Maxwell empire remained completely untouched by the blast radius. I minimized the chat transcripts and opened a clean, secure terminal window. The deadline was Friday at midnight. Jamal was running out of oxygen, which meant his next move would be reckless, violent, and utterly predictable. He could not wait for a drawn-out legal battle. He could not rely on fake court injunctions. He needed my physical signature on a transfer of assets document, and he needed it today. I cracked my knuckles. My eyes locked on the glowing monitor. It was time to give my brother-in-law exactly what he wanted on a silver platter rigged with federal explosives. I minimized the cartel chat logs and opened my standard public-facing email client. As a forensic auditor, I spent years teaching corporate clients how to secure their communications against corporate espionage. I knew exactly how hackers infiltrated networks, which meant I knew exactly how to leave the front door wide open while making it look like a terrified accident. Jamal was desperate, but he was not stupid. He had likely hired a dark web tech firm to monitor my digital footprint the moment I walked out of the law firm yesterday. They would be tracking my IP address, monitoring my unsecured traffic, waiting for me to make a mistake. I was going to give them a masterpiece of a mistake. I opened a new message addressed to Attorney Montgomery. I did not use the secure portal he had set up for me. I did not use a virtual private network. I routed the connection straight through the standard, easily intercepted commercial wireless network of the Hamptons estate. I even disabled the basic firewall on my router. I wanted the data packets to be so exposed that a first-year computer science student could intercept them. I began to type deliberately, letting my fingers slip to create typos, formatting the message to look like the frantic, terrified ramblings of a woman who had just realized she was in way over her head. Montgomery. The email began. Please respond immediately. Jamal froze all my bank accounts. I cannot access a single dollar. I am trapped out here at the Hamptons property, and I am completely terrified. Beatrice and Richard threw me out in the rain yesterday and threatened to destroy me. I do not know what Jamal is capable of, but my credit cards are declining and the estate funds are locked. I paused, making sure the tone hit that perfect note of absolute desperation. Jamal needed to believe the financial strangulation had worked perfectly. He needed to taste my panic. I continued typing. I have the original physical copies of the will with me. I also found a biometric safe behind a painting in the study. I opened it. Montgomery Grandpa kept ledgers. Physical ledgers tracking all the foundation money and some terrifying offshore transfers. I have them all sitting right here on the desk. I am too scared to drive back to the city to file the will with the probate court today. I am completely alone here. No security, no staff, just me and the original documents. Please tell me what to do. Can I just sign the transfer papers Jamal offered and make this stop? I cannot fight them. Please send help. I read over the draft. It was pathetic. It was the exact psychological profile my family had assigned to me my entire life: weak, easily intimidated, and entirely dependent on others to solve my problems. It confirmed that I had not yet legally filed the will, meaning the estate transfer was not yet a matter of public record. It confirmed I was alone, isolated, and entirely defenseless. Most importantly, it confirmed that the only physical evidence of their financial crimes was sitting on a desk in an empty mansion. It was an irresistible lure. For a man facing execution by an international cartel in less than 48 hours, this email was not just an opportunity, it was absolute salvation. I hovered my cursor over the send button. To make absolutely sure Jamal's surveillance team caught the transmission, I attached a high-resolution photograph of the original will and the black leather ledger resting on the mahogany desk. The metadata embedded in the image file contained the exact GPS coordinates of the Hamptons estate timestamped to the current minute. It was a digital flare gun fired directly into the dark sky. I clicked send. The progress bar zipped across the bottom of the screen, and the email vanished into the ether. I immediately closed the laptop, severing the connection. I did not need to wait for Montgomery to reply. I had already spoken with him through a secure satellite phone channel hours ago, warning him to ignore any unencrypted communications from my public addresses. He was already drafting the necessary cover stories on his end to keep my family completely in the dark. I stood up from the desk and began preparing the physical environment. If my psychological profile of Jamal was accurate, he would not wait for nightfall. The cartel deadline was breathing down his neck, and my email had just informed him that the window of opportunity was wide open. He would assemble whatever hired muscle he could afford on short notice and drive straight out to the coast. I moved through the massive study, meticulously arranging the scene. I placed the black leather ledger right in the center of the desk, perfectly aligned with the brass lamp. I set the notarized copies of the will right beside it. I left an expensive fountain pen resting on top of a blank sheet of paper, a visual cue of my supposed readiness to surrender everything to them. Then I walked to the heavy oak double doors of the study and pulled them wide open. I moved down the hallway, unlocking the grand front entrance of the mansion. I disarmed the localized perimeter alarms. I wanted them to drive right up to the front steps. I wanted them to walk through the doors feeling like absolute conquerors. They needed to feel the intoxicating rush of total victory right before the floor gave way beneath them. I returned to the study, pulled a heavy, high-backed leather chair into the center of the room, and sat down facing the open doors. The storm outside had completely died down, leaving the estate wrapped in a chilling, heavy silence. I crossed my legs, rested my hands calmly on the armrests, and looked at the clock on the wall. The bait was in the water. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the predators to arrive. 70 miles away in the heart of Manhattan, the atmosphere inside the Maxwell townhouse was suffocating. The air conditioning was running at full blast, but Jamal was sweating straight through his custom-tailored Italian shirt. He paced back and forth across the Persian rug in the living room, a crystal tumbler of scotch gripped tightly in his hand. The $50 million cartel deadline was a literal noose tightening around his neck with every passing hour. He had stopped checking the stock market and started checking the security cameras outside his building, terrified that the collection team had arrived early. Vanessa was sitting on the velvet sofa, chewing aggressively on her thumbnail. Her credit cards had started declining that afternoon. Jamal had quietly drained their personal accounts to cover the bare minimum operating costs of his collapsing hedge fund, leaving her humiliated at a high-end boutique. Richard was pouring himself his fourth drink at the wet bar, while Beatrice paced near the window, complaining bitterly about the social fallout they would endure if the country club found out about their financial situation. They were a family of cornered rats, mere hours away from turning on each other to survive. Then a sharp metallic ping echoed from the sleek black laptop resting on the glass coffee table. Jamal froze. He set his scotch glass down so hard the liquid sloshed over the rim. He had paid a small fortune to a dark web surveillance firm to monitor the digital traffic coming in and out of the Hamptons estate. He lunged across the coffee table and opened the laptop. His dark eyes scanned the intercepted data packet, reading the unencrypted email line by line. A low, vibrating chuckle started deep in his chest. The chuckle quickly escalated into a loud, booming laugh that echoed through the tense living room. The sheer, overwhelming relief radiating from his body instantly shifted the energy in the space. "I told you," Jamal shouted, slamming his hand triumphantly against the edge of the table. "I told you she would crack." Vanessa jumped up from the sofa. "What is it? What did she do?" Jamal spun the laptop around so the entire family could see the screen. He magnified the intercepted email and the attached high-resolution photograph. "Look at this masterpiece of cowardice." She routed it straight through the unsecured local network. "She is begging the lawyer for help. She says she is terrified, completely alone, and ready to sign the transfer papers to make it all stop. And look at the photo. She left the physical ledgers and the original will sitting right on the desk." Beatrice rushed over her designer heels, clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She read the panicked words Cassidy had deliberately crafted, and a wicked, satisfied smile spread across her face. "She was always such a fragile, pathetic girl," Beatrice sneered, adjusting her silk blouse as her elite arrogance came flooding back. "One night alone in the dark, stripped of her bank accounts, and she completely crumbles. I knew the financial freeze would break her spirit. She does not have the stomach for this level of conflict. She is exactly where she belongs, crying in an empty room, waiting for someone to rescue her." Richard let out a long, heavy exhale, running a hand through his silver hair. He stared at the photograph of the black leather ledger resting on the mahogany desk. "That book contains every wire transfer we authorized from the foundation. We have to get our hands on it tonight and burn it to ash. If she hands that over to the probate courts or the authorities, we are finished." "We are not just burning the book," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a cold, ruthless register. "We are taking everything. The cartel deadline is tomorrow night. I am not waiting for a drawn-out legal surrender or for the lawyer to drive out there and hold her hand. We are going to the Hamptons right now. We walk in, we put the asset transfer documents in front of her face, and we do not leave until her signature is on the dotted line." Vanessa clapped her hands together, a sudden vicious excitement lighting up her eyes. "Finally. We can kick her out into the dirt where she belongs and get our lives back. I want my yacht, Jamal. I want everything that old man promised us. Jamal was already pulling out his encrypted cellular phone. You will get it, babe. But we are not taking any chances. She is desperate, which means she might try to lock the doors or call the local police when she sees us pull up. I am going to make a few phone calls and stack the deck so heavily she will not even be able to breathe without our permission. He dialed a number he kept strictly off the books. It belonged to a private security contractor who specialized in hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive asset seizures. Jamal did not mince words. He ordered 4 heavily armed ex-military contractors who knew how to clear a massive residential property without asking questions. He promised them triple their usual rate for immediate same-day deployment. Next, Jamal opened his contacts and found the number for a local law enforcement official in the Hamptons. Sheriff Higgins had been on Jamal's payroll for years, accepting generous cash envelopes in exchange for ignoring the noisy, extravagant parties the Maxwell family threw during the summer season. Sheriff Higgins, Jamal said smoothly when the line connected. I have a highly sensitive family emergency at our coastal estate. My sister-in-law is suffering from a severe psychotic break. She broke into the property, she is highly unstable, and she is hoarding sensitive corporate documents. I am heading out there with my family to conduct a wellness check and secure the premises. I need you to meet us at the gates with your cruiser. Bring an official eviction mandate. I will make sure a $50,000 campaign donation finds its way to your office by Monday morning. Jamal hung up the phone and smiled at his family. It is done. We have the muscle to intimidate her, and we have the badge to make it look completely legal if the neighbors get curious. Richard walked over to the wet bar and poured himself a fresh drink, raising the glass in the air. To Theodore Maxwell. His empire is finally in the right hands. Beatrice laughed a high, cruel sound as she picked up her designer handbag. Let us go show the little penny counter what real power looks like. Jamal grabbed the freshly printed asset transfer documents and slid them into his expensive leather briefcase. He adjusted his suit jacket, feeling the intoxicating rush of absolute victory. He had outsmarted the cartel, he had outplayed the old man, and he was about to crush the annoying little auditor who thought she could stand in his way. They marched down to the underground parking garage of the townhouse. 3 black luxury SUVs were already idling their headlights, cutting through the dim concrete space. The family climbed into the plush leather interiors, surrounded by wealth, arrogance, and a completely false sense of security. As the convoy rolled out onto the wet Manhattan streets and headed east toward the coast, they truly believed they were predators closing in on a trapped, helpless rabbit. They had absolutely no idea they were driving straight into a federal slaughterhouse. As the 3 black luxury vehicles sped eastward on the Long Island Expressway, cutting through the damp night air, I was sitting in the dead quiet of my grandfather's study. The trap was baited. Now I needed the teeth to spring it. My encrypted satellite phone vibrated on the mahogany desk. The caller identification was masked, displaying a routing string of random shifting numbers. I picked up the heavy device and pressed the green button to accept the connection. Cassidy Maxwell, I answered, my voice steady. This is Special Agent Keller, FBI Economic Crimes Division. The gruff, authoritative voice came through the encrypted line. I received your data packet 15 minutes ago. I also have United States Attorney Vance on a secure conference line. You have our undivided attention. Talk to me. I did not waste time with pleasantries or emotional appeals. Agent Keller, Attorney Vance. What you are looking at is a comprehensive forensic audit of Vanguard Apex. My brother-in-law Jamal has been operating a massive Ponzi scheme. The legitimate revenue of his hedge fund flatlined over 2 years ago. To cover the massive shortfall and prevent a run on the fund, he and my parents, Richard and Beatrice Maxwell, embezzled over $100 million from the Maxwell Family Charitable Foundation. We are reviewing the routing numbers right now. The U.S. attorney said, her tone sharp and entirely focused. This is a staggering amount of capital to siphon from a registered nonprofit. But your email mentioned a cartel and a conspiracy to commit murder. That elevates this from white-collar financial fraud to a RICO case and homicide. Do you have the documentation to back that up? Open the folder labeled Obsidian Global, I instructed, pulling up the corresponding file on my own terminal to guide them. Jamal solicited $50 million from an international money laundering syndicate to plug the bleeding holes in his portfolio. They gave him a hard deadline of Friday at midnight to return their principal investment. He is completely insolvent. My grandfather discovered the entire operation and was preparing to bring this exact evidence to your office. I heard the rapid sound of typing on the other end of the line. I see the drafts, Keller muttered, his voice tightening. Theodore Maxwell was putting together a whistleblower packet. He was going to burn them all to the ground. He never got the chance to send it, I said, my grip tightening on the heavy satellite phone. Open the subfolder named Thorn. 2 days before my grandfather's fatal car crash, Jamal wired $200,000 from a shell company to a man named Elias Thorn. Thorn is a known mechanic with a criminal history of vehicular sabotage and insurance fraud. They paid him to cut the brake lines on my grandfather's Aston Martin. Dead silence fell over the federal conference line. When Keller finally spoke again, his voice was laced with pure professional malice. They murdered a billionaire to cover up a cartel debt and a charity embezzlement. And now they are moving to secure the estate to pay off the syndicate before the Friday deadline. Exactly, I said. And I just gave them the perfect excuse to act recklessly. I sent an unencrypted email from the estate network, making it look like I am terrified alone and holding the only physical copies of the evidence. Jamal's surveillance team intercepted it. They are currently en route to the Hamptons. They are bringing private security contractors and a corrupt local law enforcement officer to force me into signing over the $10 billion estate before the sun comes up. A home invasion and forced extortion under the color of law, the U.S. attorney noted. If we catch them in the act on top of the financial evidence you just provided, they will never see the outside of a federal penitentiary. I do not just want them caught, I said coldly. I want them decimated. I want a full federal strike team. I want armored vehicles, tactical gear, and federal warrants. They think they are walking into an empty house to bully a defenseless, crying accountant. I want them to walk into a federal trap. Keller let out a low, sharp breath. You realize the severe danger here, Cassidy. If they are bringing armed contractors and a dirty sheriff, this could easily escalate into a firefight. You are placing yourself directly in the crossfire. I am the bait, I replied without a shred of hesitation. They need my physical signature on the transfer documents. They will not shoot me until they have the paperwork executed. But I need to know you will be in position before they breach the property line. We are mobilizing right now, Keller stated, the sound of organized chaos already echoing in the background of his audio feed. I am pulling the tactical response team from the New York field office. We will approach the estate by sea and air to avoid triggering any early warning systems Jamal might have set up on the main roads. We will infiltrate the perimeter and secure the interior of the mansion before they arrive. What about Elias Thorne? I asked. The mechanic. I am dispatching a unit to kick his door down in Queens as we speak, Keller said ruthlessly. Faced with accessory to murder and federal conspiracy charges, a guy like Thorne will flip on your family before the handcuffs are even tight on his wrists. We will have his written confession in hand by dawn. Excellent, I said. Cassidy, the U.S. attorney, interjected, her voice carrying a tone of genuine, profound respect. I have worked with forensic auditors for 20 years. I have never seen a dossier this clean, this devastating, or this thoroughly verified. You have handed us the prosecution of the decade on a silver platter. They threw my belongings into the freezing rain and told me I was dead to them. I replied, staring at the thick oak doors of the study. I am just returning the favor. See you at dawn, Agent Keller. I disconnected the call. The secure satellite phone clicked off, leaving the massive study enveloped in silence once again. I walked over to the mahogany desk and looked at the bait I had meticulously arranged. The black leather ledger, the notarized copies of the will, the expensive fountain pen. I adjusted the pen slightly, making sure it rested perfectly parallel to the documents. Every single detail needed to sell the illusion of my complete submission. I walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling manicured lawns of the estate. The storm had fully passed, leaving the night sky crystal clear. Millions of stars reflected off the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean in the distance. My family was speeding toward me right now, drunk on their own arrogance fueled by sheer desperation and greed. They thought the Maxwell Empire was ripe for the taking. They thought I was nothing but a fragile roadblock they could easily smash to pieces. I sat back down in my grandfather's heavy leather chair and folded my hands in my lap. The chessboard was set. The federal pieces were moving into position. The endgame was finally here. The horizon over the Atlantic shifted from pitch black to a bruised metallic gray. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns of the Hamptons estate. I remained seated in my grandfather's leather chair, watching the high-definition security monitors I had linked to my laptop. The federal tactical teams had infiltrated the property 2 hours ago under the cover of darkness. They moved like absolute ghosts. I never heard a single footstep on the hardwood floors, never saw a single flashlight beam sweep across the corridors. Agent Keller had simply sent a single encrypted text message to my secure device reading that they held the house and were awaiting the breach. At exactly 6 in the morning, the heavy, oppressive silence of the coastal road was shattered by the deep, aggressive roar of high-performance engines. On my monitor, I watched 3 massive, blacked-out luxury SUVs turn off the main highway and approach the front entrance. Finding the wrought iron gates standing wide open just as I had left them, the drivers did not even pause. The convoy accelerated up the long, winding driveway, their thick tires crunching loudly and violently against the gravel. They drove with the absolute reckless entitlement of people who believed they owned the very ground they were parking on. The 3 massive vehicles slammed to a halt in the circular motor court right at the base of the grand front steps. The heavy doors swung open simultaneously. Jamal stepped out first. He had changed out of his Manhattan business suit and was now wearing a dark, expensive cashmere overcoat, trying desperately to project the image of a ruthless, untouchable mob boss. Vanessa emerged from the passenger side, clutching a designer handbag against her chest, her face twisted into a grotesque, triumphant smirk. Richard and Beatrice stepped out of the second vehicle. My mother looked around the massive property, her eyes glittering with unchecked greed, mentally calculating how quickly she could redecorate the classic stone facade to suit her own vain aesthetic. From the third SUV, the hired muscle deployed. 4 massive men stepped onto the gravel. They wore tactical dark clothing, heavy boots, and carried themselves with the rigid, aggressive posture of ex-military private contractors. They had sidearms holstered visibly at their hips and held heavy black batons in their hands. They immediately fanned out, taking up intimidating positions at the base of the marble steps, scanning the empty windows of the mansion. They were trying to look like an elite strike force, completely unaware that heavily armed federal agents had sniper rifles trained directly on their chests from the second-floor balconies. Finally, the local law enforcement arrived to legitimize the raid. A heavily marked county cruiser pulled up behind the luxury SUVs, its red and blue lights flashing silently in the cold, gray morning light. Sheriff Higgins stepped out of the driver's seat. He was a bulky, red-faced man whose uniform looked entirely too tight around his waist. He was carrying a thick manila folder and a red and white plastic megaphone. He looked sweaty, shifting nervously from foot to foot, likely thinking about the $50,000 campaign donation Jamal had promised him to make this illegal eviction look like a standard judicial procedure. Sheriff Higgins waddled up the marble steps, standing safely behind the wall of private contractors. He raised the megaphone to his mouth. A loud screeching burst of static pierced the quiet morning air, causing a flock of seagulls to scatter frantically from the nearby oak trees. Cassidy Maxwell. The sheriff's voice boomed, artificially amplified and echoing aggressively off the stone walls of the mansion. This is the county sheriff. I am holding a court-ordered emergency injunction and a temporary conservatorship mandate. You are currently trespassing on restricted property. We have medical personnel on standby. Walk out the front doors with your hands visible. Bring all requested financial and estate documents with you immediately. If you refuse to comply, we are authorized to breach the doors and remove you by physical force. Jamal could not resist the urge to gloat. He snatched the megaphone roughly from the sheriff's hands. He stepped right in front of the armed guards, feeling entirely invincible, believing he had outsmarted a cartel, a billionaire, and the legal system all at once. "Cassidy," he shouted, his voice dripping with pure, concentrated venom. "The game is over. We froze your accounts. We locked you out of the trusts. You have nowhere to run and nobody to call. Bring the ledger and the will out here right now. If you make my guys break down those doors, I promise you your psychotic break is going to get very physical and very painful." Beatrice stepped up next to him, placing a hand affectionately on his cashmere shoulder. She cupped her hands around her mouth and screamed up at the second-story windows, assuming I was hiding and crying in a bedroom. "Do not be an idiot, Cassidy. You brought this entirely on yourself by trying to steal from your own family. Just bring the papers down and sign them. We will have the sheriff escort you to a nice, quiet psychiatric facility where you can get the help you clearly need." Vanessa laughed, a shrill, piercing sound that cut right through the cold morning air. "Come on out, little sister. You wanted to play with the big boys, right? Let us see how tough you are when the police are putting you in the back of a squad car." I sat in the study watching their pathetic, noisy circus on the high-definition security feed. The sheer magnitude of their arrogance was staggering. They had brought an illegally bribed cop and a squad of mercenaries to a federal ambush. Jamal was actually holding up the fake asset transfer documents, waving the crisp white papers in the air like a flag of absolute victory. I stood up from my grandfather's leather chair. I smoothed down the front of my gray suit jacket, ensuring there was not a single wrinkle in the fabric. I picked up the blank piece of paper and the expensive fountain pen I had left on the mahogany desk. I walked out of the study, the heavy soles of my shoes clicking steadily against the hardwood floor of the corridor. I moved toward the grand foyer, descending the sweeping marble staircase with slow, deliberate precision. Outside, Jamal was screaming into the megaphone again, his patience wearing thin as the cartel deadline ticked closer in his mind. "I am giving you exactly 60 seconds, Cassidy. Then we are kicking the doors off the hinges and dragging you out by your hair." I reached the massive double front doors of the mansion. I placed my hand on the heavy cold brass handle. The air inside the grand foyer was perfectly still. I took one final deep breath, letting the forensic auditor step aside and letting the rightful heir of the Maxwell Empire take full control. It was time to open the door. I turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the massive double doors outward. The heavy oak swung open on its reinforced hinges with a deep, resonating groan that instantly silenced the shouting outside. I stepped out onto the sprawling marble portico, the morning breeze catching the edges of my gray suit jacket. I stood at the top of the wide stone steps, looking down at the invading army gathered in my driveway. The contrast was striking. Below me was a chaotic mob fueled by greed, desperation, and raw panic. They had brought armored vehicles, hired mercenaries with batons, and a corrupt law enforcement officer sweating in his tight uniform. I had brought nothing but myself, a blank sheet of printer paper, and an expensive fountain pen resting loosely in my hand. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The sheer shock of seeing me stand there perfectly composed and entirely dry-eyed momentarily paralyzed them. They had expected to find a weeping, broken woman huddled on the floor begging for a truce. Instead, they found the sole owner of a $10 billion empire looking down at them with the detached clinical observation of a scientist examining a petri dish of highly predictable parasites. Beatrice was the first to recover from the shock. She pushed her way past one of the armed contractors, her designer heels clicking sharply against the gravel as she marched to the bottom of the marble steps. She looked up at me, her face twisting into a sneer of absolute concentrated contempt. "Look at you," Beatrice spat, her voice echoing across the quiet coastal property. "You are actually trying to look brave. It is pathetic, Cassidy. It really is. You thought you could lock yourself in this mansion and play billionaire for a night. You thought holding a piece of paper signed by a senile old man magically made you our equal." I did not respond. I simply watched her, letting the silence amplify her rising hysteria. I knew she was a woman who stole millions from pediatric cancer charities, yet she stood there acting morally superior. "You are a joke," Beatrice continued, taking a step up the stairs, her voice growing louder and more vicious. You have always been a joke. You sit in a gray cubicle under fluorescent lights counting other people's money. You are a glorified human calculator. You do not have the intelligence, the pedigree, or the spine to manage a global corporate empire. If you actually took control of Maxwell Holdings, you would bankrupt the entire legacy in a month. You lack the vision. You lack the ruthlessness. You are nothing but a minor bureaucratic annoyance, and you are currently trespassing in my house. She gestured wildly to the massive stone facade behind me. This belongs to me. I am Theodore Maxwell's only daughter. I am the rightful heir. You are just a glitch in the paperwork, a temporary inconvenience that we are fixing today. Vanessa stepped up right beside our mother, feeding off the aggressive energy. She crossed her arms, her diamond rings catching the morning light. You really thought you outsmarted us, did you not? Vanessa laughed, a harsh grating sound. How was your night in the dark, little sister? Did you enjoy finding out that $10 billion on paper means absolutely nothing when your bank accounts are frozen solid? You are entirely broke. You cannot even afford to order a pizza right now, let alone hire a lawyer to fight us. Richard moved to flank his wife, his face flushed with arrogant satisfaction. It is over, Cassidy. He spoke with the condescending tone of a parent scolding a toddler. We warned you what would happen if you defied the family. We told you we would cut off your resources. Now we have the county sheriff standing right here with an emergency court order. You are legally incapacitated. You are trespassing. You are entirely out of options. I remained perfectly motionless. I held the blank piece of paper and the fountain pen in my hand, letting them see it. To their desperate, greedy eyes, those items looked like a flag of surrender. They believed I had brought the pen out to sign my life away. Behind Jamal, Sheriff Higgins rested his hand on his utility belt, puffing out his chest to look intimidating. He tapped the red and white megaphone against his thigh, waiting for the signal to arrest me on bogus charges. The 4 private security contractors shifted their weight, their hands resting loosely near their holstered weapons. They were entirely prepared to rush the porch, tackle me to the ground, and drag me out of my own home. They had all been paid exceptionally well to look the other way, while a massive financial crime was committed in broad daylight. Jamal had lost his patience. The $50 million cartel deadline was burning a hole in his brain, and he could not waste another second on Beatrice's theatrical monologues. He shoved past his hired mercenaries, his heavy footsteps thudding violently as he marched straight up the marble steps. He did not stop until he was standing just inches away from me, utilizing his massive height to tower over my much smaller frame. He ripped the forged asset transfer document from his leather briefcase and shoved it aggressively directly against my chest, crushing the crisp paper against my gray suit jacket. I am done playing games with you. Jamal growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble meant only for me to hear. The veins in his neck were pulsing visibly. You are going to take this pen, you are going to sign on the dotted line, and you are going to hand the estate over to me right now. If you hesitate for even 1 second, I am going to signal the sheriff. He will put you in handcuffs, drag you down these steps in front of everyone, and lock you in a psychiatric hold for the next 30 days. He leaned his face so close to mine I could smell the stale coffee and sheer panic on his breath. He pointed a thick finger at my face. Sign the paper, Cassidy. Sign it, or I will let my guys throw you onto the pavement and we will take it by force. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. The sharp edge of the forged legal document crinkled loudly against my collarbone, pressed hard by Jamal's trembling hand. He was breathing heavily, his broad chest heaving under his expensive cashmere overcoat. I looked directly into his dark, bloodshot eyes. I saw the absolute terror hiding just beneath his aggressive, domineering posture. The $50 million cartel debt was screaming in his mind, deafening him to all logic and reason. He honestly believed he was the apex predator standing on this porch. He believed physical violence and loud intimidation were the ultimate currencies of power. As a forensic auditor, I knew the truth. Real power does not need to scream through a megaphone. Real power does not need to shove paper against someone's chest. Real power operates in absolute silence until it is time to drop the hammer. I let my gaze flick briefly over his broad shoulder. At the bottom of the sweeping marble steps, Beatrice was tapping her designer shoe impatiently against the wet gravel, waiting for the victorious moment she could finally step over me and claim her stolen throne. Richard was whispering something to Sheriff Higgins, likely confirming the logistics of tossing me into the back of a filthy squad car. Vanessa was practically vibrating with malicious excitement, her eyes locked eagerly on the paper crushed against my chest, waiting for my ink to hit the page so she could go buy her luxury yacht. The four private military contractors stood like stone statues, their hands hovering dangerously near their holstered sidearms, waiting for Jamal to give the signal to attack. It was a perfect, picturesque portrait of an organized criminal enterprise operating with complete impunity in broad daylight. They had brought an army to crush a single accountant. They thought I was entirely isolated. They thought stripping me of my bank accounts and threatening me with a corrupt county sheriff would paralyze me with fear. They expected the quiet, overlooked sister to simply collapse under the sheer weight of their collective authority. But as I looked at their greedy, expectant faces, I felt no fear. I felt only the icy, calculating precision of a trap perfectly executed. Every single variable had aligned exactly as I had modeled it in the war room. I had mapped their desperation, predicted their timeline, and baited the hook with absolute perfection. I looked back up at Jamal. The heavy scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp, sour odor of his nervous sweat. He pressed the transfer document harder against my suit jacket, his jaw locked tight. "Are you deaf, Cassidy?" Jamal growled, his voice vibrating with barely contained violence. "Pick up the pen. Sign the paper right now, or I swear to God I will let them break you in half." I slowly raised my left hand. Jamal smirked, a fleeting flash of triumph crossing his face. He assumed I was finally yielding, reaching up to take the document and sign my life away. He assumed his brute force tactics had won the war. Instead, I simply opened my fingers. The blank sheet of printer paper and the expensive gold fountain pen I had carried out with me slipped effortlessly from my grasp. The heavy pen hit the marble portico with a sharp, resonant clatter. The sound cut through the tense morning air like a gunshot. The blank paper fluttered uselessly to the ground, landing in a small puddle of rainwater right next to Jamal's polished leather shoes. Jamal's triumphant smirk instantly vanished. His thick brow furrowed in deep, aggressive confusion. He looked from the fallen pen back up to my face, his mouth opening to issue another violent threat. He could not comprehend why the weak, submissive girl he had bullied her entire life was not following his script. He never got the chance to speak another word. A slow, razor-sharp smile stretched across my face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the smile of a predator watching the steel jaws of a trap snap shut. I raised my wrist with calm, deliberate precision, pulling back the sleeve of my gray suit jacket to check the time on my watch. The silver hands aligned perfectly on the dial. "You are 5 minutes early," I said, my voice projecting clearly and steadily across the entire motor court. Jamal blinked rapidly, the gears in his desperate mind grinding to a violent, sparking halt. He stared at me, trying to process the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. He was trying to decode the meaning of my words, but his brain was too clouded by his own arrogance to realize he had just walked blindly into a slaughterhouse. Down in the driveway, Beatrice let out a harsh sound of annoyance, yelling up the stairs to ask what was taking so long. Sheriff Higgins shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting nervously on his utility belt. Before Jamal could even formulate a response, I took a single deliberate step backward. I did not turn around. I did not touch the heavy oak doors behind me. I did not have to. With a massive synchronized mechanical groan, the double doors of the mansion were violently pulled open from the inside. They swung inward with blinding speed, crashing heavily against the interior walls of the grand foyer. The sudden explosive movement sucked the air right off the porch. Jamal flinched, taking a rapid half-step back, his eyes darting from my face to the dark, cavernous space that had just opened up behind me. The morning sunlight poured into the grand entryway, cutting through the shadows and illuminating the absolute nightmare I had been hiding inside. The arrogant swagger completely drained from Jamal's body in a fraction of a second. The transfer paper he had been pressing against my chest slipped from his trembling hand, joining my blank sheet of paper in the mud. He was no longer looking at a helpless accountant. He was staring directly into the terrifying, overwhelming force of the United States federal government, fully armed, armored, and ready to annihilate his entire world. Stepping out from the shadows of the grand foyer was a solid wall of tactical body armor and federal authority. Over a dozen heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured onto the marble portico, fanning out with synchronized military precision. The bold yellow letters spelling FBI across their tactical windbreakers stood out in stark contrast against the classic stone architecture of the mansion. They carried high-powered rifles, their expressions completely hidden behind dark ballistic visors and helmets. The sheer physical presence of the federal strike team instantly dwarfed Jamal's hired muscle. Leading the pack was Special Agent Keller. He did not wear tactical gear. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit, looking every bit the ruthless apex predator of the Economic Crimes Division. He stepped out onto the porch right beside me, his posture exuding an absolute, unshakable command of the situation. Standing to his left was the United States Attorney, a formidable woman, holding a thick stack of federal warrants secured to a heavy clipboard. Jamal stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the wet marble steps. He hit the railing hard, his massive frame suddenly looking incredibly small and fragile. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The aggressive, bullying hedge fund manager had been instantly vaporized, replaced by a terrified man realizing his entire criminal empire had just been seized by the federal government. Down in the motor court, the ripple effect of the federal presence was immediate and deeply satisfying. The 4 private military contractors Jamal had hired to intimidate me took exactly one look at the FBI strike team and made a rapid career-saving calculation. They did not reach for their holstered weapons. They did not try to negotiate. They immediately raised their hands high in the air, stepped away from the luxury vehicles, and dropped to their knees on the wet gravel. They knew the difference between a wealthy client paying for an illegal eviction and a federal mandate authorizing deadly force. Sheriff Higgins, the corrupt local officer expecting a $50,000 campaign donation, turned the color of spoiled milk. The red and white plastic megaphone slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering loudly against the driveway. He raised his hands, his entire body trembling, as 2 federal agents moved swiftly down the stairs to secure him, stripping his badge and sidearm before he could even utter a word of protest. Beatrice and Richard stood completely frozen by the 3rd SUV. My mother's eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen before. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the muddy ground. Richard looked like he was having a physical medical emergency, his chest heaving as he stared at the federal agents pouring out of the house he thought he was about to conquer. Vanessa grabbed her father's arm, letting out a high, panicked, whimpering sound, her elite arrogance completely shattered. Special Agent Keller stepped to the edge of the portico and looked down at the terrified group. Jamal Maxwell, Richard Maxwell, Beatrice Maxwell, and Vanessa Maxwell. Keller's voice boomed across the property, carrying a cold metallic authority that required no megaphone. This property is currently under the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are all subjects of a massive federal probe involving wire fraud, money laundering, and the embezzlement of over $100 million from the Maxwell Family Charitable Foundation. The United States Attorney stepped forward, raising the heavy clipboard. We hold federal warrants for your immediate arrest, and we have already secured injunctions freezing every single domestic and offshore asset tied to Vanguard Apex and your personal holdings. Your financial networks have been entirely seized. You have zero access to capital, zero access to private flights, and zero leverage. Jamal gripped the marble railing, his knuckles turning white. He shook his head frantically, trying desperately to construct a defense. "This is a mistake," Jamal stammered, his voice cracking wildly. "You have no proof." She manipulated the data. "Cassidy is a disgruntled heir. She forged those ledgers to frame us."